It all started late at night. The young man was sitting in his office and slowly falling asleep because of how boring his work seemed to him. The guy wanted to be reborn in another world. Ichijo did not understand what his friend was talking about and began to ask him again. Very soon, the boy heard footsteps approaching him, but then Ichijo gradually began to open his eyes. He was still alive, and the goblin was very surprised by this. The monster turned around and began to examine his weapon questioningly. The young man's eyes were clouded, and looking at the goblin, he did not understand why this monster was so surprised. He did not know for sure, but most likely the reason was his strong head. At some point, Ichijo realized that he had to do something, and he thought that while the goblin was a little confused, he had a chance. The guy swung his fist. Ichijo put all his strength into this blow and hit the goblin right in the jaw. With a furious face, Ichijo throws the goblin away from himself several meters. The goblin flies back and hits the wall, leaving a large mark on it. Ichijo was amazed that he had such power and continued to stare at the monster. After all, even the wall cracked from his blow, and the guy's traction force was no more than 30. And in general, it was strange that he managed to stay alive after such a blow from the bat. It was then that Ichijo remembered the data from yesterday that had appeared on the screen this afternoon. It was the character's stamina and muscle strength parameters. The goblin unstuck from the wall and began to rise gradually, immediately reaching for his bat. Ichijo did not hesitate and jumped on the monster, deciding to repeat his success. When the young man got on top, he immediately began to take the bat from the goblin, pressing him to the ground. Both screamed in this fight not for life, but for death. At some point, Ichijo managed to get hold of the weapon, and then he grabbed the goblin by the neck and said that now the same thing awaits him as happened to Ichijo. The girl in office clothes grabbed his head and said that the young man had the audacity to ignore his superiors, which was simply disgusting. The guy grabbed the bat tightly and started swinging, bringing the bat behind his back. He stood up a little and screamed loudly, lowering the weapon down towards the monster's head. The goblin couldn't withstand even the first blow, and Ichijo continued to beat him, shouting that the guy would be able to survive this day and would not die again. And then it was all over. The goblin's head was a smeared pancake, and blood was flying all over the walls and the nearby vending machines. Ichijo knew that he had succeeded, and he was very happy about it. The next second, the guy began to fall to the side and fell exhausted to the floor. He couldn't even move because he had lost a huge amount of blood. Ichijo, of course, somehow killed the monster, but his head did not stop splitting from this. Looking at the goblin, Ichijo thought that in any case, his head was in a much better position than his opponent. Then a soft sound rang out, indicating a system notification. The screen was once again in front of the young man. He had received a bronze trophy for killing his first monster. He had also been given a bit of physical strength and had now leveled up. As soon as he thought about the level, white symbols immediately began to hover around him. Ichijo was scared, not understanding what was happening, but then he felt a surge of strength from the inside. He had never felt so much power filling his body, but it was useless as the boy began to lose consciousness. In the end, he thought about leveling up, and his eyes closed. The boy realized it was Non-Ace's manager. The girl let him go, and Ichijo immediately fell to the floor. Now said that the boy suddenly passed out, as if his battery had died. Afterwards, the guy woke up again in his office and heard a familiar voice calling him. Ichijo still looked disgusting because he was very scared. Now came up to him from behind and said that looking at Ichijo, one could assume that the guy was not feeling well. Ichijo immediately began to get up from his chair. This time he didn't even listen to Now or anyone else. The guy stood up and immediately headed towards the exit, deciding to use the fire escape. Ichijo ran up the stairs, now fully aware that he was definitely returning to the past every time, because he was here again. Soon he reached the very top. Opening the door to the roof, Ichijo walked to the edge of the building. He realized that he had returned before the monsters destroyed the world. Looking down, Ichijo fell to his knees. He was broken and did not understand at all how best to act and what to do now. Some kind of plan was needed. Suddenly, he saw a status. At that moment, the guy realized that his values, except for his level, would remain the same if he died. Therefore, points and abilities were transferred. It really was starting to look more and more like a computer game. The young man didn't understand why everything was happening this way. Afterwards, After examining his status, Ichijo clenched his fist and decided that it was too early to give in. He absolutely had to go and do it. He shouted that whether this world was different or not, he was still going to level up here and survive no matter what. Ichijo said that he just dozed off for a bit, but it would be strange for him not to wake up from such brute force. Now laughed, saying that Ichijo always sleeps on the job. Ichido was the only one in this reality who knew about the invasion of otherworldly monsters. From that moment on, the global reversal coefficient began to increase. In a few hours, this world will be consumed by chaos and taken over by hordes of terrible monsters that will begin to destroy everything in their path and dominate people. Only he, Ichijo, having died several times, continued to return to the past. The young man knew that this world was doomed and would soon be destroyed. Ichijo clenched his fist, understood it, and told himself that it was too early to give up. His position allowed him to try to change everything every time. In essence, the guy had some kind of immortality, so he decided that he was going to survive no matter what. Ichijo stood up from his seat and shouted this phrase. Then now appeared behind him with a fan made of folded paper. She hit the guy in the back of the head, telling him not to raise his voice in the building during work. Ichijo turned to the girl, addressing her. Now said that the boy had long since forgotten himself. Now everyone except him had already finished their workday and were leaving the office. Then the boy thought that time was flying by so fast. He turned to Now and said that he still had some work left that he wanted to finish, so he would stay here for now. Now wasn't very happy about this. She leaned over to the guy and said in a raised voice that he was going to stay up all night again. This horrified her because Ichijo already had bags under his eyes, Ichijo's documents, and said that it would be much faster if she did it for him herself. The girl sent the young man home, but he did not agree. Cold sweat continued to run down the guy's face. He was still thinking about the dream, or rather, the all-too-realistic nightmare, because he felt everything very well with his body. Ichijo started to walk back, trying to catch up with his manager and get the work folders back, but the girl turned around and very firmly told Ichijo to go home. At first, Ichijo tried to object, but it was useless. He went to the vending machines to get some food. He knew that he gave in because of Nao's pressure, because she was scary when she was angry. But then Ichijo remembered that if he were to return home now, he would again be killed by the same Minotaur that was the goal of his quest. Ichijo wasn't ready for it yet, so he decided that he would stay here for a while without Nao's knowledge, and he needed to check something. Ichijo took a rather pompous pose, stretched out his hand and pointed his finger at an empty space. He called up the status, thinking that the system should react to this word. Soon he saw his current status. The guy returned to the first level, but his overall was already the third. Then he poked at his skill to see the details. Ichijo was surprised that he had resurrection. Afterwards, he started to slide, looking at another menu and realized that he had some points that he could distribute. Ichijo could increase the stats of various abilities, but soon he saw that there were other skills that could be unlocked. Many options opened up before him. He thought it was really cool. There were many skills, but there were also some weird ones, like the art of sensual storytelling. His eyes were running wild, and Ichijo still didn't know what to choose. Still standing by the food machine, the boy looked at the skills and decided what he would take. To open a new talent, he needed 3 points, and Ichijo only had 2 so far. Now leaned over to him and asked how the boy was feeling. Therefore, the young man had a choice of whether to increase his statistics or wait, and then open a new skill and pump it up. Then Now appeared behind him. Ichijo was frightened by her appearance and began waving his arms. The young man began to reassure himself that no one could see the screen except him, so everything was fine. Manager Now began to ask her employee the reason why he had not yet gone home. Ichijo quickly began to think of a reason, and then said that he was waiting for Now to finish. The girl closed her eyes, telling him that he was probably still following the company guidelines manual they were given on their first day. Ichijo didn't understand at first, but Now immediately said that it said, "Don't leave your boss without going home first." She said that he was the only one who did that. Afterwards, the manager said that they could go home. At this point, Ichijo's primary concern was to safely level up and acquire skills. He needed to be prepared for what was about to happen on the city streets. They began to separate, and Now stopped, saying that she was going the other way. Ichijo went on after saying goodbye to his supervisor. But before he could go far, the girl called him. Ichijo turned around to listen to Now. The girl was a little embarrassed, trying to collect her thoughts. Then she said that there were many worries and sufferings in life. And despite all this, she saw how the guy kept a low profile. Afterwards, she came closer and took Ichijo by the shoulder. She, continuing to blush slightly, said that if something was bothering the young man, he could consult Now from time to time. Ichijo turned his head and shouted that he was fine and would finish all his work by the end of the day. Now also said that a boss's job is to take care of his subordinates, so the guy could completely rely on her, or at least just start sharing his thoughts with her for now. It was obvious that it was not easy for her to say this, because she was very embarrassed. Afterwards, Now quickly turned around, adjusted her bag, and said that that was all, and they would meet tomorrow. Ichijo understood that in a few hours Now would be overtaken by monsters, but he didn't want to think about it yet. On the other hand, he understood that he couldn't save anyone today. As he began to move in the other direction, Ichijo decided to try to set himself up positively, so he told himself that everything would be fine with his boss Now and that she would definitely cope. Ichijo went to the local supermarket where he began dumping a bunch of items into a cart. Soon he paid and carried the pile of bags back to the office. He dropped his full backpack and started to put things away. He decided that the office would be his small fortress for the time being, so he decided to stock up on provisions right away. There could also be panic among the people, and many would start robbing stores. Therefore, Ichijo decided to prepare in advance, taking several knives, a first aid kit, food, and water. Suddenly, the guy noticed a glossy cover in one of the bags. It was an adult magazine, and Ichijo immediately shouted at himself that he bought it in such times. Ichijo turned around, looking at his hand, which he began to clench into a fist. He had bought quite a lot of things, but the bag felt light for him. Apparently, this was due to the increase in his muscle strength stat. So, having laid everything out on tables and in cabinets, Ichijo decided that for now he would stay inside the building, using it as a base for leveling up. There was a Minotaur wandering around his house, so it was best not to approach it for now. Now grabbed the boy by the cheeks and started shaking him. She looked closely at the boy's face and said that he had bags under his eyes. After unpacking, Ichijo decided to have a snack. He found a ready-made burger, unpacked it, and looked at his watch. Soon, monsters would appear in the city. Ichijo also took out his phone and started looking at the news and various social networks. Perhaps someone could already notice something strange, and then the guy came across a photo of a goblin. Ichijo continued scrolling through the feed. There were a lot of such photos, and the guy understood that monsters were definitely in many different places. They appeared here and there. Afterwards, he saw a very unusual sight. Someone posted a photo of a huge dragon that appeared in China. It was very strong in appearance. Ichijo couldn't even imagine that even such monsters would appear here. He thought that the dragon would definitely be dealt with by the country's self-defense forces. So, time flew by very quickly. The curtains were also closed and it was 3 a.m. Ichijo realized that it was time to finish with the phone and start getting ready. The young man stood up from his chair and began to get ready. The guy hung a couple of knives, which he had also bought in the store, on his belt, and began to conveniently fix his clothes. The time had come, and one of the last touches was a construction helmet that could protect his head. The guy headed towards the elevator and urged himself to get ready. He was ready to go level up. Afterwards, he went out into the city and most of the streets were still empty. Ichijo walked with his knife out, looking around. Looking around the empty alleys, Ichijo was surprised that there was absolutely no one. The city was not as wild as he expected. For a moment, the boy thought that no one had appeared in this part of the city. Ichijo objected, saying that it was nothing to worry about. Ichijo came out on one of the roads where there were many empty cars. The guy knew for sure that these monsters were definitely hiding somewhere, and he had to be extremely careful. As he passed by, Ichijo noticed several dead townspeople. This made him afraid, and he didn't understand why he was still so afraid, because he had seen all this before. Suddenly, he heard a scream in one direction. Most likely there was a monster there, and he needed to make sure what it was, because the guy's target now was weak monsters. Coming out from behind the corner, he saw a crowd of people surrounded by a crowd of goblins. The people were scared, not understanding where these strange monsters came from. The police stood and protected the people with batons and pistols. They tried to hide everyone in the building, but the people demanded that they open fire quickly. Ichijo assessed the situation. There were 4 or even 5 goblins, and the humans had nowhere to run. This was a great risk for the boy, so he hesitated for a long time about his intervention. The police were far outnumbered, and they were also scared, just like the people standing behind them. It was really risky, so Ichijo knew he couldn't do it. The young man decided to retreat, thinking that the police weapons would help them fight back. But suddenly, he heard the sound of another notification and decided to see what was there. It was some kind of quest again. He had to defeat 100 goblins, but he saw that he now had 0 on his account. Apparently, they had a tie in the office then, because both died. At this time, the goblins began to attack the people who were standing behind the police. They pulled out one of the girls and began to cut her, piercing her with knives. The guy really worked hard and often did extra work. However, now continued to shake him and said that meeting deadlines is important, but health always comes first. Ichijo stood there dumbfounded looking at this. The police were also busy, not knowing what to do. They didn't dare open fire on the monsters. The crowd began to shout that the police were doing nothing and it was time to intervene. One of the policemen pulled out a gun and started shouting to his commander. Then he took aim and fired at one of the goblins, hitting him in the head. The monster was thrown back several meters, and scarlet blood immediately began to flow from the hole in his head. Everyone thought that this killed the goblin, but he immediately began to get up. He was very angry, so he immediately went to the policeman who shot him. As it turned out, they even withstood bullets. The goblin jumped on the policeman and plunged the blade into his head, killing the poor guy. Seeing this, Itidzi started to run away, realizing that if he did not run away, he would die immediately. He thought that he had no chance to cope with so many monsters. Still, the boy considered that his own life was much more important than the lives of others. The death of other people did not matter, and Ichijo no relation, and he continued to run. Suddenly, Ichijo heard a familiar scream, and when he turned around, he saw one of the goblins cornering now and holding his weapon over her. Everything inside the boy turned over. The guy immediately rushed to help the girl as fast as he could, dropping his backpack and helmet along the way. He understood that he couldn't leave her now and give her to the goblin. Ichijo took out one of the knives he had, swung it at the goblin, but it jumped aside. The boy immediately stood between the monster and now, getting into a fighting stance. Probably, each of us dreamed about it at one time or another. The young man was obsessed with various games and wanted to get such an opportunity to test himself for real. Afterwards, she let go of the boy and started to walk away in the other direction. Now said loudly that she would soon be leaving, so she asked everyone else to wrap up as well. Now started screaming, asking how the boy got there, but he wanted to know the same thing from her. At this time, the goblins became much more numerous as the others came to help. Ichijo turned to Now and yelled at her to get out of here as fast as she could. Ichijo nervously joked that this was also one of the company's principles. He then repeated it, proudly saying that you can't leave your boss without going home first. These words brought tears to Manager Nao's eyes. The boy grabbed the knife tightly, realizing that there was no point in hesitating now. He remembered all the times when Nao tried to take care of him and protect him, so now he had to repay her this debt by not leaving her in her hour of need. The goblins began to approach closer, but Ichijo continued to stand firm. He rushed towards them, brandishing a kitchen knife. A skirmish was inevitable, and the goblins began to utter a terrible battle cry, squealing. Nao's protection gave him a lot of strength and motivation. Ichijo crushed his enemies left and right, cutting them with his weapons from the supermarket. Nao was surprised that the guy was able to handle these monsters. She didn't expect this office worker to open up like that. Afterwards, he rushed towards Nao and started shouting for her to get up quickly. They urgently needed to escape from here before the monsters that were stronger came. At this time, another crowd of goblins approached and began to look at Ichijo with anger. This time, there were even more of them, and they were more heavily armed than the previous ones. Something flashed through Ichijo's mind. It was as if he felt déjà vu, because he remembered the conversation that had just happened between him and the manager. Now continued to sit on the asphalt and said that he had knocked down those previous ones. Ichijo said that he could not defeat such a large number, especially with a kitchen knife. The boy continued to urge the girl to get up and run, and the goblins were getting closer and closer. now apologized and said that her legs were not obeying her at all and she could not get up. Ichijo decided to take matters into his own hands and quickly lifted the girl up, placing her on his back. Now was frightened and screamed, and Ichijo asked her to be patient for a while. The guy said that they would have to go back to the company for now, since it was safe there for now. Ichijo was currently heading towards the office. It seemed they had managed to break away. Ichijo continued to carry the girl on his back, and she said that he was a fool, because one wrong step and they could have died. Afterwards, the girl thought that he was really a fool, but she liked his courage. Now thanked Ichijo, but was embarrassed to repeat it when he asked again. Ichijo continued to wonder if he could protect her in this crazy world. They continued to run through the city, where there was complete chaos and destruction. Soon Ichijo and Now were already in their office. The guy put the girl on the floor and began to examine her wounds. After that, he began to bandage her. Now asked to be a little gentler because it was painful. But Ichijo said that future wounds could be fatal if emergency measures were not taken in time. Afterwards, he brought a couple of bags and said that they had water and food, so the girl could use everything, but in moderation. Ichijo also offered the girl clothes or a wool blanket. A colleague approached Ichijo and said that he was very jealous of the guy. He would also like to wake up from the suffocation that manager Nanase was causing him. Ichijo said that he would never have that chance. The girl rummaged through her things for a while, looking for clothes that would suit her, and suddenly saw something interesting. She called out to Ichijo, asking about the contents. Now picked up the adult magazine and started laughing. Ichijo went over to her and snatched the magazine from her hands, trying to justify himself, looking for a suitable reason. The girl was also embarrassed, just like Ichijo. She said that there was nothing shameful about it, because it was just very unexpected for her. She didn't mean anything unusual. Ichijo took a bottle of water and went to one of the windows. He carefully pulled back the curtain, and Now immediately asked if he saw any monsters. But the guy said that everything was fine. Ichijo turned to the girl and asked her why she went to the convenience store in the middle of the night. Now replied that she was just going to finish up some work and went to get an energy drink. The girl began to remember this trip to the store and immediately became gloomy. She said that at that moment many people died before her eyes at the hands of monsters. Fear took hold of her, and she began to emotionally scream about how just a few hours ago everything was completely normal. She did not understand where monsters appeared in their world from. These creatures attacked peaceful people, devoured them, and firearms had no effect on them. So, apparently, it was not worth relying too much on the self-defense forces. Ichijo said that all this aggression is happening all over the world, as he saw it on social media. The guy wanted to suggest that soon, it seems, it will all end. But with all this, doubts crept into him. Because if the world really was going to end, then what was the point of this status and various talents? After finishing his workday, Ichijo went outside and headed home. Along the way, he observed several cases where an adult couple was breaking up and a young boy had overindulged in alcohol. Afterwards, the guy thought that Now could also have a status, and he wanted to check it. Ichijo decided to ask her to call the status, or try to do it. But as soon as he turned around and looked at the girl, Now sat down in the corner and fell asleep, hugging her knees. Ichijo decided to bring a blanket and covered the girl, saying that she could rest as much as she needed. It was safe here until the morning. The guy had confirmed this after his last death. However, to survive further, he had to level up anyway. After Ichijo covered Now with a warm blanket, he looked at his watch and realized that he couldn't rest forever. Something had to be done to continue to survive. He carefully crept up to the girl and said that he would definitely return alive. The young man asked her to wait for him a little while until he returned here. He walked out into the city, beginning his second attempt at leveling up. Now he needed to find a suitable target to start with, but ideally the goblins would do. Although he could only defeat a single goblin so far, if he encountered a monster that he could defeat while searching for the goblin, he would still fight it. The guy noticed that there was a lot of noise and pillars of fire in the city center. There were a lot of screams and shots, so it would probably be better not to go there. Suddenly, he saw two huge bees flying towards him. Their stinger was covered with something, and Ichijo ducked, hiding behind the car, and continued to watch. These bees were really huge and terrifying. As it turned out, there were several people on their stingers who had already died and were hanging there. as if on a spit. Ichijo continued walking forward, holding his briefcase in his hands. The boy thought about it, because he actually saw these scenes too, as well as the conversation with his manager. It was interesting to see where they were dragging him. Ichijo thought that he needed to be more careful now and watch the area above. Suddenly, he decided to turn into a small alley. Turning around, the guy saw something else horrible. People became victims of plants. The plant itself looked like Japanese ivy, which catches its prey and eats it. The young man decided to continue moving for now. There had to be a monster somewhere that he could defeat. Suddenly, there was a noise ahead. At first, Ichijo couldn't see what was approaching him, and initially thought it might be a car. But he soon saw that it was a monster running towards him. A large wild boar with massive fangs and a fierce gaze ran straight at Ichijo. The boy understood that he had nowhere to run, and he could not do it. Out of the corner of his eye, the young man saw broken windows at a nearby building, and at the last moment decided to rush straight there. He ran towards the windows and made a long jump. The boy made a noise by breaking the remaining glass in the frame and attracted attention. But the boar ran on, and Ichijo tried to catch his breath, glad to be alive. Sitting down on the floor, the boy realized that he had escaped. Ichijo also realized that gradually more and more new monsters began to appear in the city, which were becoming stronger. Suddenly a goblin appeared in front of him, who was alone. The guy was a little scared, and the goblin stared in surprise at his new prey. Ichijo bared his teeth and was about to run away from the goblin, but then he realized that this reaction was already a habit. He had already begun to forget why he had come out in the first place. This seemed very strange to him, and the guy thought that he was developing dementia. He touched his head and said that his hair had been thinning since he was 25. If Ichijo didn't fight, then his level wouldn't rise, and that meant he wouldn't be able to survive. He took out his knife and thought that the goblin was alone here, and without a weapon. Ichijo rushed at him with a knife and immediately stabbed him in the neck, knocking him to the ground. But the goblin continued to wave his arms and try to resist. The vitality of these creatures was abnormal. He plunged his knife into its chest and then stabbed it in the throat, but it was still alive, so Ichijo decided to cut its entire throat. The goblin's skin was quite hard and didn't cut easily. In addition, the guy was armed with a kitchen knife, which was not suitable for fighting monsters. The goblin continued to fight back with all the strength he had left, pushing his paws into the boy's face. But Ichijo, at some point, firmly said that it was time to stop. Ichijo was very angry, so he raised the knife higher and slashed at the goblin's head. It immediately separated from the body and flew towards the broken windows. Ichijo sat down, leaning his elbows on the shelf. He leveled up and opened an account in his new quest. The guy had already died twice and didn't think it was possible to get used to it. Suddenly, he heard someone's voice. It was the voice of a woman crawling on the floor towards the guy with the knife and asking him for help. Ichijo went to meet her. The girl was covered in blood and was reaching out her hands to Ichijo. She was in a terrible state, and her feet were no longer in place. Most likely, the goblins separated them so that the people would not run away. Ichijo raised his head and saw that there were several such bodies, and they were all lying in one big pile. Only one girl was alive. And then Ichijo realized something. Soon he approached a dark alley where there was almost no light. The guy stopped and remembered that he had already been in this place. Suddenly, he heard some sound. He should have noticed it earlier, when he saw the bees dragging people somewhere. All monsters get their own habitat. All these people were some kind of blanks from monsters. In other words, the guy realized that he had not ended up in an ordinary store, but in a goblin lair, and soon found himself surrounded by them. A mass of bloodthirsty goblins. It was unknown whether Ichijo would survive this critical moment, but things were definitely bad for him. Really bad. The boy looked at the goblins and knew perfectly well that if he didn't do anything now, he would become part of the pile that was behind him. In that case, he would be eaten alive. The goblins continued to stand there in a huge group and stare at the boy. Ichijo decided that a great idea for distraction would be to point his hand to the side and shout something, like UFO, for example. But after he made a loud noise and shouted at them, they immediately broke loose as if they were on a chain and ran after the guy in a horde. Ichijo realized that he had done this in vain. From the outside, it looked like Ichijo Akira was a member of the Japanese national track and field team. Or at least that was the thought that came into his head. He continued to run from the huge crowd that was making its way, both above and below the shelves, knocking everything down. Suddenly, two goblins with knives appeared in front of them at the exit. They blocked his way, and Ichijo decided to turn aside, saw an escalator inside the building. He immediately rushed up, deciding that he could leave through the second floor. But at that moment, the goblins appeared in front of him, and in the same huge number that had been running behind him. Now the guy was surrounded, enclosed on both sides. The sound was quite long and loud. It was heard several dozen meters away from Ichijo, and resembled the screeching of a rusty car dragging along the road. Still, he realized that he would die now, because no matter what Ichijo came up with now, there were too many of them anyway. But it wasn't that bad because he had the resurrection skill. Suddenly, the boy began to think about what would happen to Now in this world if he died and left her all alone. Most likely, monsters would catch up with her and deal with her. Ichijo had promised her today that he would definitely return to her office. So he couldn't just up and die now. He had to think of something. The young man broke free from the crowd of goblins who were trying to grab him. They had not managed to inflict any serious wounds on him, so he was still able to resist. Even if all this seemed pretty cool, Ichijo still didn't have a plan of action. However, there was one idea that could work in this situation. There must be something that could help. Most likely, it could be some skills from the status that could help in a situation. Ichijo went all in and decided that he would acquire a skill. Opening the panel, the guy saw that he was given the choice of analysis, expertise, or body strengthening. He had already accumulated enough points, but now he could not think about the choice. The guy chose strengthening the body and went to attack the goblins. Ichijo's strength had increased significantly, and when he struck the first goblin in his path, it was immediately pierced through. The young man entered into a frenzy and began to beat down the remaining goblins. The boy himself was amazed that he had become so strong, genuinely surprised by it. He continued to crush the goblins until they were all gone. The sound was indeed similar to someone dragging something metallic and heavy, but, unfortunately, it was very difficult to see anything in the darkness. Soon, it was all over, and Ichijo had defeated all the goblins that were in the supermarket. The guy's fists were burning with bright fire, and he himself was damn tired. He looked at his hands with a wide smile, continuing to be happily surprised at the power and enormous importance that just one skill could give in a battle. While the young man stood there looking at his status, a second group of goblins approached and began to surround Ichijo. The boy realized that he was in for a second round. At that moment, Ichijo decided that he would keep the monsters company for the rest of the day, and soon their bodies were lying on top of each other, and the boy stood proudly shouting into the air. 1. Ichijo was no longer afraid of this group, and besides, he had become a sworn enemy of the goblins. Ichijo succeeded and was able to raise his level and stats, but the results were surprisingly small, even though he dealt with an entire army. Suddenly, he received a notification for the guy killing all the goblins and completing the E-Class quest, which involved defeating 100 goblins. He was given a reward in the form of a chest. Ichijo raised his hands up, clenching his fists and rejoicing that he had completed the quest. Everything went as he had planned, because there were really a lot of monsters, and he had succeeded. The young man was pleased, because he also managed to get a trophy, as he understood. Well, all this could wait, and now it was necessary to sort out the reward. Ichijo was shocked when he opened the chest, because he immediately received 10 points as a reward, and 2 points on top for completing the first quest. Now he had 16 points. Suddenly, the young man saw the source of the sound. A huge silhouette began to emerge into the light of the lanterns. Ichijo tensed up, very afraid for himself at that moment. It was really cool, which made the guy smile widely again. With that amount, he could gain all sorts of different skills that would make him even stronger. As it turned out, with the acquisition of the sworn enemy of goblins, the guy's damage to monsters of this class was increased by 3%, but their hostility also increased by as much as 20 points. On the streets, the monsters began to scatter in different directions. They all gave way to Ichijo's old enemy, who thirsted for the boy's death, and was moving towards him, the Minotaur. So, Ichijo already had 16 points. So the young man had a choice about what to do. He could divide them by ability values or take a skill. From the new skills, he could take the manufacture of weapons and armor. which sounded pretty good. But the disorganization and materials of monsters, although terribly necessary, took a lot of time. If it was a question of safety, it was very difficult to refrain from detecting danger and reconnoitering the enemy. But Ichijo was still weak and had to defeat the enemies more difficultly. Afterwards, Ichijo remembered that each skill had its own level, and he could improve them. The guy called up the status and then decided to pump up the strengthening of his body. But what Ichijo saw shocked him. Improving a skill cost 20 points, and that was too much for him at the moment. He thought about taking out a loan or something. The boy grabbed his head, thought for a bit, and decided that he would acquire level 1 analysis. Goblin points wouldn't raise his level any further, so he had to decide something. In general, if he could improve, if he acquired a skill that would allow him to understand the strength of enemies, he would be able to fight more or less safely, picking up the enemy. He just wanted to fight mythical creatures and monsters, marry a princess and become a prince. In general, have a bright and joyful life in another world. It was the same monster he had dreamed of in the office. The same bull that had split him in two and started eating him while he was still alive. After pumping up his analysis, Ichijo decided that he would use the remaining points to strengthen his second-level body for now. After looking around the store, Ichijo decided that this would be the best decision. The guy looked at the dead goblin and called up the analysis function. He immediately saw the monster's statistics, determining its level and indicators of endurance, speed, and so on. The goblin's vitality was 12, almost the same as Ichijo's now. He began to examine the other goblins and realized that they were all surprisingly tough. It was time to get out and move on. Ichijo pulled out his phone and looked at the time. It was still morning, and he was afraid that something might have happened now during this time. Ichijo ran out into the street, jumping over a broken window, and as soon as he found himself on the road, he immediately saw two wolves who were angrily walking towards him. After looking at the wolf status, the guy saw that the gray wolf was level 13 and had quite high speed indicators, 50, as well as high endurance and muscle strength. In general, to sum it up, Ichijo realized that the wolves' data was much higher than his. He did not know whether he could overcome them and looked towards the animals. The wolves took a few more steps towards him, baring their teeth, but then immediately disappeared with one deft movement, jumping out in the other direction from the young man. Ichijo smiled, scratching his chin. The boy did not understand why they ran away and thought that they were afraid of him. Apparently, such power emanated from him that it was impossible to hide. But it was time to go. So Ichijo decided that now was not the time to be careless. The boy hurried towards the office where he had set up a temporary base. Ichijo shuddered. Could it be that this monster was not a dream? It simply could not happen in reality. And the young man thought that somewhere a movie was being filmed. It was very strange that the city was silent. There were no shots or screams, and there were no signs of monsters nearby. Suddenly, Ichijo heard some strange sounds behind him, but they were familiar to him. This scraping of metal that was dragged along the asphalt. The guy turned his head tensely. It was the same Minotaur boss. Ichijo guessed that the situation in the city might have changed because of him. He was still at a decent distance, so it was possible to escape. But after that, Ichijo decided that he would push these thoughts away and far away. By laying down 100 goblins, Ichijo thought that he would be able to compete with the boss. But Ichijo was already completely different, much stronger. He decided to apply analysis and saw that the boss was level 45. His indicators were off the charts, and he realized that it was impossible for him to win now. The difference was simply enormous, so now there was no doubt. Ichijo began to run as fast as he could from the boss, realizing that he could not even determine how many times stronger he was than the goblins. Ichijo was very wrong then. He was just prey for the Minotaur. The monster caught up with the guy, and with a blow of his axe, threw the guy into the neighboring building. Ichijo flew several dozen meters and made a hole in the building, hitting a window on the 6th floor. Blood from the impact flew across the walls, and windows even burst at the other end. Ichijo was lying among the rubble of the floor near the stones with reinforcement. Now he clearly understood that he could not defeat him, and he needed to urgently think of how he would escape. The boy stood up and started running along the windows of another office building, pressing the wound on his hand, received from the collision. He was thinking about now. The huge bull with the body of a man screamed, and his eyes looked in different directions. It was terrible, and after the monster's howl, Ichijo immediately ran away in the other direction. Suddenly, the boy saw a new message from the system. The global reversal rate had exceeded 1%, causing the initial strength of the monsters to increase. Ichijo continued running, not understanding what was being said. He didn't know what this global coefficient meant and how it could affect the strength of monsters in this world. There was no time to deal with this, because the main task now was to escape from the Minotaur. Suddenly, the monster unexpectedly appeared in front of Ichijo, jumping onto the floor and breaking through it. At that moment, the guy looked at him and saw that the Minotaur was already level 80, and all of the stats had increased by almost 50%. He became much faster. Along with the speed, his health and size increased. The Minotaur swung his axe, and in one blow, Ichijo was reduced to dust. The system confirmed the fourth death. After another resurrection, Ichijo jumped up from his chair and began to hug now. The girl immediately became embarrassed and did not understand what was happening at all. She thought the guy was trying to hit on her, so she immediately slapped him on the cheek, screaming at the guy to control his actions at work. Ichijo fell to the floor, and the girl added that the boy was behaving very stupidly. If someone saw them, she wouldn't know what to do next. At that moment, Ichijo began to gradually come to his senses. The boy grabbed his head and realized that he had died again. This scared him, and he realized that he was absolutely pinned down. He remembered the Minotaur and realized that even at level 45 he was just a monster. And now he was level 80, which made him even stronger, almost twice as strong. The guy kept saying to himself that this was complete nonsense. He thought that he was going to die, and he was very scared because he didn't want to die. Then he remembered that before his death he had seen some kind of notification. There was something about that very reversal coefficient that gave the monsters a boost. It was necessary to study it more carefully to understand the reason for the increase in the boss's power. The percentage exceeded 1 in the afternoon, as Ichijo recalled. It was a nightmare, because the more time passed, the stronger the monsters became each time. So, scared, Ichijo thought that he could only run away. He understood that with such progression he definitely wouldn't be able to defeat them. There really were no reasonable options except escape. The guy called himself a taxi. When Ichijo got in the car, he was greeted by a man in a black suit and shirt. The young man asked for a ride to Kanagawa and said he would pay more for speed. Ichijo wanted to get as far away from the city as possible. After he managed to ensure safety, he knew that only then would he return for now. They continued driving along the highway, and then their attention was drawn to a huge boar walking along the road. The taxi driver said that they were very rare to meet in the city. Ichijo understood that monsters were gradually starting to come to the city. He conducted an analysis and found out that the boar was level 12 and had fairly average stats, close to wolves. The guy had a bad feeling inside, and soon the taxi driver shouted something and began to brake sharply. The car immediately went to a skid, moving off the road. Ichijo shouted what the reason was, and the taxi driver looked ahead in horror and said that something terrible was right in front of them. The young man looked at the windshield. Ichijo continued running, when he suddenly turned his head and saw that the Minotaur was already above him, having caught up with its target. It swung its axe and struck the ground. In front of them was one of the machines, which was divided into 2 parts and very evenly. Behind the machine, the silhouette of a tall and strong creature with a body like a human was visible. It was a huge orc with a large and sharp blade in his hands. The orc's level was 37, and his stamina and muscle strength exceeded 100 units. After analyzing, Ichijo leaned forward a little and shouted at the frightened taxi driver not to stop under any circumstances and to press the pedal. But they didn't have time to make the necessary maneuver to get away from the orc. The monster turned and hit the car with its fist, which immediately dented and probably killed the people inside. Ichijo came to his senses again in the office. The young man sat there for a while, completely motionless, when Now approached him from behind for the umpteenth time. The guy understood that he was not leaving for the city he had originally wanted. He needed to run away as quickly and as far as possible. He needed to consider his options further. That same day, Ichijo decided that it would be much safer to use the train, since it picks up crazy speed and travels underground for most of the journey. Suddenly, the train started to slow down, and then there was a crash that caused the people inside to collide. No one understood what could have happened, thinking that there was an accident. Literally a few seconds later, the train began to tilt. It was another boss, whose name was Giant. He looked like a large, wild monkey with white fur. The monkey threw one of the carriages into its mouth and immediately clenched its jaws. After that, Ichijo came to his senses again. Finding himself in the office in his work chair, Ichijo fell to the ground and then began to crawl, not giving up trying to get away. He felt a strong burning sensation, and after that it was increasingly difficult for him to take a normal breath with his chest. He soon realized that no matter where he tried to run, this city was held by monsters in your hands, so he was doomed to certain death. Even if he didn't run away but hid, they would still find him and kill him. Ichijo understood that deaths and resurrections would be repeated over and over again. This resurrection simply had no end, so Ichijo at some point thought that it was in hell. It was truly torment, and his psyche began to break down. Once again, when the young man came to his senses after being resurrected in the office, he placed his hands on his knees and leaned towards the floor. Ichijo was depressed and did not know what options he had. Now approached the guy from behind and asked how Ichijo was feeling. The guy tiredly wandered towards the exit and dejectedly said that he was leaving. Ichijo walked down the hallway. He realized that he hadn't tried another option. Hope appeared in his eyes, and he realized that he could try killing himself. After all, it could stop everything, freeing the office worker from this hell. He believed that it should work, because he was already in complete despair. When Ichijo came out on the roof, he went to the railing and leaned on it. Looking down, the young man began to climb the small wall and began to ask God to let him die. At the very last moment, when Ichijo was about to take a step down, something suddenly pushed him back. It was Nao, who grabbed the boy and pulled him back. Ichijo turned to the girl and began asking her what she was doing there. The girl screamed at the guy to get away from the edge as quickly as possible. Continuing to crawl, the boy suddenly realized that his legs had completely stopped obeying him. He understood that if he did not leave, he would definitely become a corpse. The girl was very scared by what she had just seen. She said that she would come to her senses soon, and then explained that she was not afraid of heights, but she just didn't like them. She then added that it was a very good decision when the girl decided to follow the guy and began to carefully climb up to the roof after Ichijo. Ichijo didn't know how he could justify himself now. He said he was just trying to get out and get some fresh air, but his words sounded uncertain. Nao asked if Ichijo had any plans for the near future. The guy did not understand his question, and Nao said that she, as a boss, was inviting a colleague somewhere to have a drink. The guys came to a small bar, where they ordered 2 large glasses of beer. Their heart-to-heart talk between the boss and the subordinate began right now. Nao began to take off her jacket, leaving only a blouse, looked at Ichijo and told the guy not to be modest and to drink as much as he could. Ichijo said that he was not in the mood to drink now, and after a short pause, the guy said that it was pointless. Nao looked at the young man sadly. She still didn't understand how she could help her colleague. Ichijo's face was completely blank, and besides, he was silent and didn't say anything. Soon, they were brought 2 beers. After thinking for a bit, the girl said that only in that case could he return home and jump out of the window, or whatever he wanted to do on the roof of the office. Ichijo didn't understand what the girl was talking about, and then she smiled sweetly and said that the conditions could be fulfilled if he could drink this mug of beer faster than she could. But when Ichijo raised his head, he saw his legs falling in front of him. They had been thrown down by the Minotaur, who wanted to see how the man would start screaming in terror. Afterwards, Ichijo raised his sad eyes, reached out and grabbed the mug of beer. He agreed to the terms and threw back the beer, starting to drink it to the very bottom. Half a minute later, Ichijo put his glass down and felt a little sick. He still had half of it, and Nao had already finished the mug and shouted that she had won. After that, their conversation became much more relaxed. Nao said that they hadn't chatted leisurely for a long time, although they used to talk a lot on the way home from school clubs. Afterwards, she started to chuckle and reminded Ichijo about the time he lost his application as soon as he got a job. She recalled that he acted as if the world was ending. Ichijo said he didn't quite remember the incident. Nao said she recognized the face he had on the day it happened. Nao said that if something happened to the guy, he could safely tell her about it. She was very worried about him and then added that this worry was not only about his subordinate, Ichijo looked up and told the girl that within the next few hours the world would be destroyed, but the girl wouldn't believe him. Now asked if Ichijo had any evidence to back up his words. He took out his phone, seeing that it was almost 1 a.m. He then said that in a few minutes, images published on a website with the title Dragon Discovered in China were to be shown live on air. The girl found this news and turned the phone towards Ichijo. She said that he apparently talked about it and then began asking how he found out. Ichijo was simply paralyzed with fear. He froze in one position and then saw how the Minotaur took his legs again and brought them to his face, sniffing them carefully. Now screamed, calling the guy psychic, but Ichijo said that he wasn't. It wasn't that she was wrong, but he lived his life in this world over and over again. And then he added something that surprised the girl. Ichijo said that it was all because of one of his skills. She didn't understand what skill he was talking about. Afterwards, he said that the girl could, as an experiment, say the word status. And then something would appear right before her eyes. The girl took a sip of beer at that moment, and then said, "The status." A screen appeared in front of her, which scared her, and she jumped to the side. She thought it was some kind of hallucination. But Ichijo explained that this was not a hallucination, but the girl's status, which no one could see except her. Thanks to Ichijo's special status skill, he could be resurrected infinitely. The girl became embarrassed and continued to look at Ichijo. She began to touch her face with her hands, and Ichijo asked if Now believed him now. Now needed to catch her breath and continue drinking beer. Afterwards, the girl summed it up, suggesting that the reason for the guy's depression was the so-called resurrection skill. Ichijo said that she understood everything correctly. Afterwards, Now put the mug back on the table and asked the boy how many times he had already looped around in this day. Ichijo said that he had been resurrected 15 times already. There was really a lot, and then Now asked about what happened to people when monsters appeared in the world. The young man could not tell her exactly, but one thing was certain. At least the inhabitants of the city were eventually killed by a monster called the Minotaur. Afterwards, the boy saw that the Minotaur began to put his legs in its mouth and chew the flesh and bones. Ichijo was in complete shock, not understanding what to do. Ichijo then added that he had never survived past noon on that day. He explained that after that time, the monsters that appeared in this world would gain power. Afterwards, he remembered the boss and said that it didn't matter whether you were out of sight or not. But eventually the empowered Minotaur would find you and kill you over and over again. Ichijo added that by dying in this way, he would return to the past and live his life again. And when he was killed, in theory, he could not really die from this, and this was repeated constantly. The guy screamed in panic and said that he didn't know what to do anymore. No matter what level or skill he had, it was all pointless since the monsters got stronger. He was well aware that he could not escape from this hell, and it was also completely useless to talk to anyone about it because the day would repeat itself again. After a short silence, Ichijo began to rise from his seat and said that Now would not be able to understand him either. Since the boy was already tired, he asked to just leave him alone. The girl's face darkened, and she grabbed her beer. Ichijo walked away towards the exit, and, having already touched the door, he heard Now muttering something under his breath. Here, the girl jumped up and shouted that the guy had completely forgotten himself. She pointed her hands in his direction and told him to quickly sit down in his place, because the conversation was not over. Ichijo thought that the girl had drunk too much, even though they had been having a very serious conversation the whole time. He walked up to Now and she started to pull him down to the floor with her. The girl screamed that the guy had gone completely limp. She urged him to try to defeat the Minotaur while he was not yet strengthened, because it was quite logical. Only the world he imagined was not supposed to turn out like this at all. He didn't understand what was going on here. The guy's head became very heavy at some point and he fell flat, cursing and realizing that right now his life was over. Ichijo said he saw no hope for peace after this. The neighboring village had many orcs, and another town nearby was ruled by a giant monster stronger than a Minotaur. Then, she pounced on the boy and said that this was no reason to give in. She pounced on him and said that she would knock all this mood out of the guy. But Ichijo pushed the girl away and said that he had no choice but to give in. If it were possible, he would prefer to die right now. Afterwards, the guy shouted that he didn't want to live in this lonely world at all, because no one needed him, and therefore he wasn't going to fight and suffer for some unknown reason. At that moment, Now started crying and told Ichijo not to say such things. The girl said that he was not alone, and no matter when or in what world he was, she would be on his side anyway. Ichijo said that he left now to die when he tried to escape several times. The girl said that he doesn't have to worry about her. If she could laugh and drink with him in the end, so be it. She believed in him and asked him not to give up, but to seek justice and win. She continued to scream, shedding tears, saying that no matter how bitter and hard it was, she would still support him, no matter how things turned out. She pressed herself against the boy and added that Ichijo should never again talk about his death in front of her, calling him a fool. Ichijo looked at the girl and understood. He had died so many times and always forgot one very important thing that he had once set for himself. Closing his eyes, he continued to look at the Minotaur, who turned his back to him and continued to eat his legs, slurping and spitting out pieces of his office suit. The guy completely forgot that he had promised to protect this girl, no matter what it cost him, now completely gave in and began to cry, repeating that she should never hear another word about his death. After they finished their beer, Nao pulled her knees up with her hands and said that she had behaved very badly. Ichijo handed her a glass of water and told her not to be sad. Nao agreed that she would need water now. Then the guy said that her mascara was all running, which made her cry again, thinking that she looked ugly. Afterwards, Ichijo smiled for the first time that evening and began to laugh. He said that the girl was really being stupidly frank, which he really liked. Afterwards, he reached for his full glass of beer and started drinking it. Nao said that the stupidity was unnecessary, and then urged the guy to be more serious. He emptied the mug completely, drinking it down to the bottom, and then loudly set it down on the table. Ichijo declared that he would fight the Minotaur, and Nao supported him, saying that she would be with him. But the young man immediately said that he would not be able to win it yet, so he would need to relive his life a few more times to become much stronger. Nao also started to smile, and then shed another tear. The girl said that in that case, the real her from this world breaks up with the guy. Afterwards, Ichijo said that he didn't know exactly when he would have the opportunity, but he would definitely save the girl and take her with him. Nao said that she would wait. This city will sooner or later be destroyed by the Minotaur, so if such a future cannot be avoided, then he and Nao will die anyway. Then a small bell rang, and a large glowing window appeared in front of the guy. It showed the main quest that was given to the office worker, Ichijo a lot, and he told himself that he would not run away anymore, and, no matter what, he would defeat the Minotaur, and a determination for revenge was born in his eyes. The screen said that the boy had received a C-class quest. He had to fight a Minotaur and destroy this monster. Ichijo didn't understand what the quest had to do with it. He understood that what was in front of him was some kind of complete nonsense, because it all resembled more of a game with monsters and quests, and he was in his real world. And now the guy starts to open his eyes again. His colleagues' lines are repeated exactly to the sound, and in front of him is still a working monitor and keyboard. The boy is thrown into a fever again. He grabs his head and realizes that he is back where it all started. Ichijo did not understand what was happening and what losing the quest meant. This system notification frame was right in front of him. Ichijo jumped up and started shaking with fear. He realized that this was about the Minotaur quest. Soon the notification itself, or rather the frame where it was located, simply disappeared in the thin air. Ichijo was also surprised by this, not understanding where it had disappeared to. A second window appeared next. Ichijo received a bronze trophy for repeated death. The young man also received several additional stats to strength and endurance. Everything turned out completely differently, and not the way the young man wanted. He did not want to die. Ichijo stood in front of the monitor and did not understand what all these words meant. Bronze trophy, endurance. He did not understand at all what all this referred to and what kind of screen this was. Suddenly, Nao came up to him from behind, addressing the guy menacingly. The girl asked a worker whether he could hear her or not. Ichijo started to say something to her. The girl said that the guy was pale, and then said that he probably wasn't feeling well. Ichijo leaned on the table and started asking about the thing behind him. Nao didn't understand what he was talking about, and then the guy pointed at the notification behind him. He shouted that there was some kind of transparent screen with different statistics. Ichijo, in agony, continued to ask whether the boys could see him or not. But looking at their faces, the young man realized that they had already taken him for a madman. Ichijo continued to point at the empty space above and began to shout at his manager, saying that he could clearly see the transparent screen from above. Then he got indignant and said that the girl was nearsighted. Now gradually began to get angry, and at some point jumped on the guy, shouting at him that he was demonstrating to everyone a disgusting manner of speaking with his superiors. She held his head with her hands, gagged the young man, and pulled it towards herself. The girl asked him to stop talking nonsense, and then sent him to get dressed and send him home. Ichijo left the office, went downstairs, and walked for a few minutes to the park, which was very close. There he found a secluded bench under a lamppost and decided to think for a while. The guy kept thinking about the fact that he actually saw the screen. It was very strange that as soon as he looked back, it immediately disappeared, and the others did not see it either. The first death was confirmed by the system. Due to the compliance of all conditions, the system gave the subject a special skill, resurrection. The guy began to gradually open his eyes. Ichijo clearly understood one thing. He was now returning to his past every time, or rather to this same day. From this, he understood that if he went home this way, he would die. The guy was a little unhinged, and his mood was terrible. He didn't understand what to do, but suddenly, at some point, he stopped himself because it dawned on him. Ichijo quickly jumped up from the bench and shouted that in that case, he could have just gone the other way. He hoped that in that case, he wouldn't meet that horrible monster. Afterwards, he decided that he could go back to the office for a short time, because he would be safer there. And there were many other people there who could help him if anything happened. The guy returned to the office, where there was almost no one, took a warm blanket, wrapped himself in it, and sat under the desk. Ichijo realized that he was still scared, but maybe it would work. He was slightly shaken and continued to think, this time about his return after death. The young man increasingly drew an analogy with the games he once played himself. Ichijo felt tired, and his eyes were gradually closing. There were so many incomprehensible things in his head, which was starting to hurt. But he couldn't focus on just that. The boy understood that his main task, which would be better to concentrate on now, was survival. Soon, Ichijo's eyes closed completely and he fell asleep under the table. The boy was lying there, sweetly asleep, letting a little drool out of his mouth. Suddenly, he began to hear noise coming from the street. The boy began to wake up slowly, and then suddenly opened his eyes. He took out his mobile phone with horror and looked at the clock. He realized that he had slept for several hours and it was already the next day. The young man was shocked by this. He looked at the windows in the office, which were all covered. That's why he didn't see any sunlight to get him up early. Suddenly, someone shouted his name, and the boy immediately came to his senses. He was very scared by what he saw. Ichijo thought he had a terrible dream. At some point, Ichijo realized that he was still alive. The guy was genuinely happy about this, because he really didn't die, and it turned out to be very easy. Ichijo stood up from his sleeping place and thought that now would be a good time to have some coffee. He walked over to the machine, made himself a drink, and looked around at the completely empty office. There was no one, and it was strange because today was not a day off. It turns out that everyone skipped work, even the boss. Then he listened and realized that the siren was still sounding in the street. Ichijo continued to stand in the middle of the office and was about to take a sip of his hot coffee when a sharp and very strange sound interrupted him. So much so that he almost spilled everything. The guy put the coffee on the table and turned to the window. He couldn't understand what it was. From the window came the cries and sounds of wild animals, as if they were in the middle of a metropolis. Ichijo walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside a little. He saw the streets of the city plunged into chaos, huge wolves running around and killing people. Besides all this, he saw something more paranormal. Several huge wasps, which were larger than people, flew along the street as well as a giant centipede. All this really reminded him of some movie. He had never seen such large animals in nature, and on top of that they attacked a big city, killing everyone on the street. The young man began to quickly turn his head from side to side. Now he was at his workplace at the computer. But he was looking for the monster that he had just seen. The boy pressed himself against the window and screamed again about what it all meant. Ichijo wanted to be free from this, because he only thought he was free from the nightmare. Ichijo woke up in hell. Then he remembered that he had a phone from where the guy could go online and find out about this large-scale invasion of wild animals. He found the news on a smartphone and started to explore social networks. Absolutely everywhere they wrote about the invasion of monsters that had befallen the world. After which the young man rushed into the corridor to leave this office as quickly and as far away as possible. But first, he wanted to find a couple of people with whom he could exchange information. Ichijo thought that everyone was already dead, but he still did not give up hope. He was very scared, and he continued to run, asking for an answer if anyone was listening. Suddenly, as he was leaving the floor, Ichijo saw a silhouette of a man. It was his colleague, who was sitting at the next desk in the office, Sayama. Ichijo slowed down and walked towards the bench. At that moment, Ichijo felt a certain relief, because he was very happy to see at least one of the familiar people. The guy wiped the sweat from his forehead, coming closer and closer. Ichijo continued talking to his friend, asking him what the guy was doing there. But when he walked around the bench, he saw a monstrous sight. The sight of him made the young man feel sick and he started to vomit. Ichijo couldn't hold back for long, looking at how almost all of his comrades' insides were outside. Ichijo couldn't believe it. His comrade had been dead for a long time and this goblin was sitting there eating him. The sight was truly disgusting. Looking down, the boy confirmed that he was safe and sound. His legs were still in place, which meant that Ichijo had just had a terrible dream. His colleague next to him was whispering that the boy needed to go back. Afterwards, the goblin that was eating Sayama raised his head and began to look at Ichijo. The young man realized that his affairs were bad and he needed to get out of here as quickly as possible. The goblin began to climb down from the bench where he had been eating and immediately reached for his wooden club, which was covered in blood. Apparently, he had dealt with Sayama with it. Ichijo didn't know how to act in this situation. He knew that if he stood still, he would die, so he had to fight him somehow. The boy assessed his opponent and realized that he looked like a goblin from a video game. Goblins are the weakest, the small fish in video games, so the boy thought he had a chance. The goblin itself was not very big, but it looked terribly scary. It slowly approached Ichijo, grinding its teeth. The young man crawled back, shouting for the monster to not come closer. At one point, the goblin jumped forward, opening his mouth wide and shouting. All Ichijo could do at that moment was throw his cell phone, which was in his hands. The phone hit the goblin's head and immediately bounced off without causing any damage to the monster. The goblin jumped on Ichijo and immediately ended up on top. The monster pressed its body against Ichijo and grabbed him by the throat. The boy began to scream, trying to call for help. He realized that the goblin was not so weak, and then the goblin swung his club, raising it up and letting out a crazy scream. Ichijo thought he could stop all this, so he started asking for a break. The blow landed right on the head, causing quite serious injuries, and the goblin already thought that he had managed to deal with this guy in an office suit. After Ichijo now spent time at the bar, the boy went back into town to find monsters that he could level up on. The guy thought that it could well be a monster, like a goblin, because the tank itself was quite small. Now Ichijo was determined to fix this damned awful world. He looked at the two wolves and, despite his wounds, rushed towards them. Ichijo stood on the roof of one of the houses and looked out for the huge monster, waiting for it to approach at a comfortable distance for the guy. When the giant centipede started to rise up, the boy immediately jumped out and rushed towards it. During this time, Ichijo was able to come up with one of the great tactics. When the monster passed right above him, the centipede would expose its vulnerable spot, its soft belly. That's where Ichijo would strike, instantly destroying this type of monster. The young man soon descended and triumphed. This technique worked well on medium-sized monsters, and they could be easily defeated. Such were the privileges of reincarnation. Finally, another level was raised. Ichijo has died 3 times since then, and his overall level has now increased to 25, and he has also managed to accumulate 10 points. But with all this, it was still a long way to increase the level of body strengthening. The guy believed that when he could unlock the 3rd level of body strengthening, he would be able to defeat the boss. But leveling up after level 20 became very difficult. The guy could only level up 1 level, and it took him about 10 hours of battles to do that. The fastest way to gain points and experience was to complete various quests that the system could give out. But with all that, there were none. The huge number of monsters in the city were already too easy and did not bring a lot of experience, but rather just took up a lot of time. Nevertheless, he decided to kill him just in case. The main quest was connected with conquering the Minotaur, and it was the only one now. After the goblins, there were no more quests with small monsters. There was no longer a monster in this city that was stronger than Ichijo. Unless, of course, we were talking about the Minotaur, which was the main target right now. With all this, the guy did not understand what was going on and why he could not begin to fight him. In fact, he was still missing a few good skills in his arsenal. Overall, the guy came up with the idea of acquiring a magic scheme. This skill allowed living beings who did not have the ability to magic to master it. With all this, when you open this skill, which is what Ichijo actually did, the person opens a new indicator, magic power. It also increased with the increase in level. So if Ichijo leveled up and increased the value of that very power and combined it with that skill, then even at level 30, he would be able to compete with the Minotaur. So Ichijo looked at his hand, confidently clenched his fist, and told himself that there were only 5 levels left and he would be fully prepared for his final battle. The young man went to level up on various monsters. These were all he could find, but more often, the guy attacked the lairs that he managed to track down. These included wolves and various snakes. Ichijo even had to travel to neighboring cities to find worthy opponents and level up as quickly as possible. The guy kept dying over and over again. Ichijo went, bent down to the ground and pointed the knife in the direction of the noise. Soon he saw a little girl trying to hide in the tank, shaking with fear. Soon this figure exceeded 20 deaths, but he did not give up, continuing each time to continue on the path to his goal. He only dreamed of being able to defeat the Minotaur and save now. Soon the guy was able to raise his level to 30 and also earn the bronze trophy, Hunter. Once again, the guy woke up in his office. He was no longer surprised by anything and looked quite tired. His plan for every Sunday was the same. Now would walk up to him every time and grab him from behind, yelling at him for having the nerve to ignore his superiors. The boy showed no signs of resistance. Now, when she realized that she simply couldn't squeeze his neck, stepped back, surprised that the guy was incredibly strong and powerful. Each time, Ichijo stood up, took the girl's hands, and said that thanks to her words, he was able to hold out until now. The guy said that he resisted and did not take a single step back. Afterwards, Ichijo thanked the girl from the bottom of his heart, continuing to look into her eyes and hold her hands. Now was always very surprised by this, and every time, as if it was the first time. But that was how it was. She didn't understand why the young man was telling her this so suddenly, and Ichijo had asked the girl today to listen to him when everything was over. That's why he asked now not to quit her job until that moment. Afterwards, he said that she should stick to it even if something happens outside. Seeing Ichijo, the girl immediately threw herself on his neck, glad that it was not a monster, but an armed guy. Now at that moment did not understand at all what the guy was talking about. Ichijo silently turned around and said that at that moment it was time for him to go. The girl shouted after him, demanding an explanation. But Ichijo ignored this part. When he went out into the street once again, he continued to form a battle plan in his head. Today was the very day when he reached level 30 and was ready to challenge the Minotaur. There were no problems with the value of the amount of magic power, and the only weapons were his fists. Finally, the guy decided that he would need one more skill, which he immediately pumped up. So Izure did everything he could, and now all that was left was to strike. He walked through all the streets again and witnessed the scenes he had seen on his very first day. That was when he went home and came face to face with the Minotaur. The sequence was not broken at all. Everything was repeated as before, exactly to the second. The guy understood that in this case, he would definitely meet the Minotaur near the house. When Ichijo came to a dark alley, he stopped. Last time, it all started right here, and then the guy was cut in half, and his legs were eaten. The system notification immediately started beeping. Class C quest, the one who entered the battle is a Minotaur. The condition for completing the quest is to destroy the Minotaur at any cost. The boy stood and waited for the monster, being in an open space. Soon the terrible beast appeared from around the corner, picking at the asphalt with its axe and making a grinding sound of metal. The Minotaur stopped in front of the guy, and then Ichijo said that he came to get even. His hands and legs were shaking, and the guy himself felt a frightening atmosphere on himself. She begged for help with tears in her eyes. The pain and fear returned to the young man. But then he raised his head and said, "Be that as it may, I have no choice but to do it." The Minotaur entered the fray and began the fight. He swung his axe, striking where the boy was standing. But Ichijo deftly slipped away from the spot, changing his position. It wasn't that hard to dodge. The Minotaur was surprised, and Ichijo shouted that he had already figured out the monster's attack pattern. All he had to do was be extremely attentive. It was then that Ichijo struck with his fist, hitting the Minotaur right in the jaw. Blood sprayed from its mouth, and the monster's neck bent unnaturally. Ichijo began to scream, becoming completely enraged. The Minotaur responded in kind and began to squeal loudly, like a cornered animal about to be butchered. Ichijo continued to dodge the blows, jumping from place to place. He struck the animal's carcass with his fists, surpassing it in speed, although the indicator was much slower. And so their fierce battle that Ichijo had prepared for so long began. Today, he definitely couldn't retreat, despite the power and aura of the formidable Class C boss. At this time, now continued to wait for Ichijo. The girl also heard noise from the street and went to the window to see what was happening on the street. The girl immediately remembered the words of her office subordinate when he asked her not to leave work under any circumstances, even if something was happening outside. She immediately thought that something had happened to Ichijo, or that he was in trouble. The girl said that she was looking for her little sister. They were heading to the shelter together, and she lost her halfway. Then she went back to find her, but met a monster. In part, the girl's intuition did not fail her, because at that very moment, the guy was fighting his hardest battle in 22 attempts at survival. Ichijo didn't know how he could break through the Minotaur yet, because his fists did too little damage. The boy retreated, dodging his blows. The young man was forced to retreat. Even though he understood the Minotaur's attack pattern, he needed to come up with something and lure the monster into a trap where it would not be able to move so actively. At some point, the Minotaur made another attack, which Ichijo tried to dodge. But this time, he failed to calculate everything, and the Minotaur slightly touched him. Considering the enormous muscular power that the Class C boss possessed, this touch immediately sent Ichijo flying back several dozen meters. The guy flew all this distance, knocking down all the obstacles with his body, and then stopped, hitting a building. A huge dent immediately formed there, which crumbled the concrete. To be precise, the Minotaur's muscular strength was 190 units, and Ichijo's endurance, which was proportional to health, was 76 units. One serious blow or a hit with an axe could immediately end the boy's life. Soon, as he continued to lie against the wall, Ichijo realized that this was his limit, which was to be expected. Ichijo closed his eyes and began to think about what he should do now. The boy asked the girl the reason why she climbed into the tank, because it made a lot of noise and was a bad place to hide. Having slightly changed his position, Ichijo finally decided to use his trump card, which he had been saving for the very end. He pumped up the sprint skill as the very last one. Ichijo waited until the last minute, and then the bull rushed to attack. The sprint gave him acceleration, the speed of which was about 400 kilometers per hour. He decided to attack. Ichijo waited for the right moment and immediately rushed at the bull, using a sprint. He straightened his arm and punched the bull in the eye, then flashed past it as it crashed into the building. Taking advantage of the moment, the guy makes another attack on the Minotaur, pressing it into the wall. The monster screams again, continuing to spit blood. Ichijo was happy that he had such a powerful new skill. Using it, Ichijo immediately exceeded the monster's speed parameters and was faster than it. The young man also gained magical power in his status thanks to the magic scheme skill. Sprint increased speed in exchange for 1 unit of magical power. But with all this, Ichijo had a 60-second limit, as the hero's magic power was multiplied by 10 to get the result. But by then, Ichijo hoped that he would be able to finish off this monster. The girl hugged the boy tightly, saying that she was very scared. She called Ichijo uncle, but the boy did not like it and said that he was only 25 years old. The guy began to actively use sprint and run from side to side. He landed a lot of punches. The guy was already noticeably tired and noticed that even after a huge number of attacks, the Minotaur still couldn't get the blow that could knock him to the ground. Ichijo understood that when the skill ran out, he would lose his advantage in this fight. And then, most likely, he would lose. Something had to be done quickly, and Ichijo noticed a hole in the wall through which they had entered the building. The guy decided to try the following option. Ichijo began to direct his attacks towards this hole, wanting to push the Minotaur out. He succeeded in this perfectly, and at some point, a powerful blow knocked the monster out. The Minotaur continued to fly down, flying out of the building's window, and Ichijo immediately followed. The guy thought that the monster was strong, but would it withstand the metal frame? As the Minotaur began to approach the debris of the buildings it had previously demolished, Ichijo used Sprint to give the bull more acceleration. The guy screamed that it was the end and delivered a crushing blow, using all his strength and the Sprint skill. The bull crashed into the construction debris with a roar. When the dust and sand cleared a little, the boys saw that the monster was impaled by one of the iron sleepers. The Minotaur was motionless and most likely already dead. The child continued to shake with fear. She literally clung to Atidzi's hand. Ichijo, exhausted, sat down on one leg. He finally succeeded and was able to defeat this monster, gradually starting to get out of this hell. The young man was very tired, so the next moment, he fell on his back and began to sigh heavily. The Minotaur continued to lie on the iron frame with his body pierced through. Ichijo continued to try to catch his breath and told himself that he had finally completed this difficult quest, and now the bull would no longer bother him. His eyes began to slowly close, and Ichijo thought that he would take a little rest now and immediately go pick up Now, hoping that she was still safe. The sky was very beautiful and starry. While Ichijo was admiring it, he soon turned his head towards the Minotaur and thought that it was all quite strange. If the boss was defeated, then why hasn't the quest completion screen appeared yet? Also, Ichijo received absolutely no reward for such a hard-fought victory. At this moment, the Minotaur, after his lull, began to scream again and try to move. Ichigo immediately began to get up from the asphalt, crawling away as he went. Ichijo saw that the boss was still alive. At the moment when he started to climb down from the reinforcement, the boy stared at him and thought that someone was probably clearly playing a joke on him. Even after this ferocious beast was still alive and standing firmly on its feet. At some point, the guy pulled her away, saying that everything was fine and he couldn't protect him with one hand. The Minotaur had a huge hole in the middle of his body, but he kept moving. That same oppressive aura began to spread around the area again, influencing the young man. Ichijo decided to use sprint and retreat for now, watching what the monster would do. The Minotaur crouched down and then almost immediately jumped up, spreading his arms to the sides. The scream was louder than all the previous ones, and various mists swirled around the monster. Meanwhile, many people who were walking somewhere stopped and paid attention to this very scream. No one understood where it was coming from, but it sounded very creepy. A couple of minutes later, something like a meteorite landed with great force and speed on one of the central streets of the city, right next to Ichijo's office. People thought it might be a bomb or a missile, and started coming closer to find out for sure. Everyone was scared at that moment. After the dust settled a bit, people saw that it was a man who had suddenly fallen from the sky. The guy was alive, but he had made a huge hole underneath himself. More and more onlookers began to approach the place where Ichijo had fallen. Some thought that it could even be a terrorist act or a mafia massacre of a debtor. Some of them dared to approach Ichijo and began asking how they could help the boy. Ichijo opened his status and realized that even though he said he would defeat the Minotaur, now with his current level and difference, there was no point in even trying. He needed to level up. Ichijo wasn't too happy with the turn of events. The guy understood that he needed to raise his level as quickly as possible and not waste time on such things. The young man himself did not understand whether he was alive or not, because he felt his whole body. The young man continued to think about how this could happen, since he had used sprint right away. As it turned out, it was because of the boss's roar. The boy slowly began to get to his feet, telling the people to run. The next moment, very close, a second blow thundered, very similar to Ichijo's landing. Dust rose again, and the entire crowd who were close turned their heads away. The spectacle gathered more and more spectators. Some were already watching from the windows of their work, and some even took out their phones and started filming the shocking news. A Minotaur landed nearby, and many at first thought that some scene was being played out, like in a movie, because it was the first day and no one knew about the invasion yet. In this regard, the Minotaur began to correct the situation and decided to immediately show the people around him his attitude. The bull grabbed one of the girls and began to bring her to his mouth, biting off her head. At that moment, a loud scream was heard, and people started running in different directions, throwing their bags and things. Everyone understood that this was no joke. The crowd ran and began to push and push, overtaking each other. The The police officers who were nearby took out their guns and began shooting at the monster with pistols. They walked forward together, and then Ichijo decided to ask the girl how she decided to go looking for her sister when she was so afraid of everything. Ichijo watched as the monster began to devour people, restoring its health, and it was then that he thought that this was the end, and he could not do it again. Afterwards, the guy thought that it was impossible for him, just like it was initially. He always failed at the decisive moment, in the club, at work, in love. He was always unlucky or lacking something, but in any case, the guy was a pathological loser. Because of him, everyone died, and he couldn't protect anyone. The Minotaur, after finishing off several townspeople, headed towards Ichijo to see what was wrong with the guy. The Minotaur now perceived the threat and did not want to take any risks. He approached the young man, looked at his bloody body near the piled-up asphalt, and then roared menacingly, pointing his mouth upward to the sky. Suddenly, something small flew into the Minotaur's eye. A girl's voice was heard, calling the big monster to come to him, and also calling him a stupid big guy. The voice was very familiar to Ichijo, and when the monster began to turn around, he saw a girl standing with a crowbar in her hands. It was Nao, who was also scared. Since Ichijo recognized the voice, he immediately started to get up from his seat and shout at the girl about what she was doing there. The girl explained that she could not stand still when she thought that her sister might be in danger and crying somewhere, so she had to find this child. Nao tried her best to attract the monster's attention so that he would leave Ichijo alone for at least a couple of minutes, which she could buy for him. Ichijo was shouting in displeasure that the girl had violated his request that she should not go out on the street, no matter what. The guy was shaking with fear. He understood perfectly well what could happen now, and was terribly afraid of losing Nao. Ichijo shouted for the girl to run away as quickly as possible, and threw away the iron. But in response, Nao smiled and told Ichijo not to say such nonsense. Taking care of subordinates is the direct responsibility of the boss. That's why she's here. Ichijo continued to watch with a blank look as the Minotaur turned around and walked towards the girl, extending his huge hand towards her. Ichijo knew that this way the girl would definitely die. He leaned on his legs and forced himself to stand up, even though his body had no strength at all. He had to save Nao. After all, he had fought only for this and had already suffered several deaths, but he never stopped giving in. Ichijo was not going to give her to anyone anymore, so he decided to risk everything. As they continued to walk forward, Ichijo suddenly saw small stems from a plant on the floor. They were moving and resembled small tongues. This plant was definitely a trap. The boy turned and shouted sharply at the girl not to step on those stalks. She was already close, but immediately pulled her foot back. Ichijo began to explain that these tongues were a monster. It was called a man-eating plant. If the girl stepped on it, the monster would grab her body and pull her inside. The guy saw that the girl became even more scared from this and began to calm her down, telling her not to be afraid, because nothing would happen if she didn't touch them. Ichijo urged the child to pull herself together and come to him. The girl began to stamp her feet, saying that her legs were numb and she could not move from her place now. At some point, when Ichijo shouted at her again, she lost her coordination and began to fall forward, right onto that very plant. Ichijo didn't lose his head and immediately picked up the girl, took her in his arms. The guy asked if everything was okay and then returned her back to the ground. Walking around the city ruins, the guy again came across the corpses of goblins and remembered that these monsters would no longer increase his level, and he needed to find another target. The girl thanked the guy, trying to stay on her feet on her own. Ichijo realized that this path would be quite difficult, because she was just a burden for the guy. Suddenly, something caught her eye, and she stared into the distance. Ichijo thought that she was scared of something again, and asked her what happened this time. The girl saw her sister's backpack. She immediately started running towards him, loudly shouting her sister's name. Ichijo was afraid that she might attract attention with such noise, and rushed after her. As they turned the corner, they saw the man-eating plant holding a little girl in its stems. Ichijo immediately performed an analysis, and the monster turned out to be level 9, which suited him. Mei, seeing her sister, began to cry even louder. The girl wanted to run to her, but Ichijo stood in front, blocking the way with his hand. He told the child to step back. The guy warned the girl that if she found herself within reach of this monster, she would be in danger and would not be able to help her sister. Ichijo armed himself with a goblin knife and headed towards the subway. The girl's sister continued to fly on the monster's stalk, and Ichijo realized that he had no time to hesitate. The boy took the knife and rushed to help. With a sharp jerk, he quickly closed the distance to the monster. Ichijo didn't bother looking for a weak spot, so he planned to simply cut the plant into several pieces, which would definitely put an end to it. The guy was wielding his knife, swinging it in different directions. But at some point, the cannibal swept him aside with one of his powerful coils and hit him against the wall. At that moment, the guy realized that one expedition to the goblins would not be enough. Things were bad and Itadzi was already also wrapped in the plant stems. Trapped. Sister May, seeing this, began to slowly approach. Apparently, the girl took a long time to collect her thoughts. But at some point, she put her hands forward and ran straight towards the monster. The girl ran with her eyes closed, and Ichijo shouted at her that she was doing something completely stupid, because the man-eating plant was about to kill her. Walking along the platform, the guy cautiously looked around in all directions, expecting some kind of ambush. The girl ran up to her sister and stretched her arms up. With tears in her eyes, she said that she would definitely save Moya, so she could calm down. Maya also started to cry and scream to her sister. At that moment, the monster turned its attention to the girl who had just run up and started to launch a new stalk in her direction. Ichijo, without wasting a moment, took advantage of the monster's distraction. He immediately cut the stem that was holding it and began to move towards the main body. Quickly getting to the monster's side, Ichijo swung his knife and cut it in half, destroying the bud. For the kill, he immediately rose to level 9. Afterwards, the guy landed on the ground. He was slightly wounded and understood that the only thing that saved them all now was the fact that the monster's consciousness was chained to other people. The girls began to hug each other, still shedding many tears. Ichijo watched all this from the side, giving them some time to hug. Watching all this, the guy smiled dryly and thought that in the end, saving people wasn't so bad, because inside he felt like a hero. The girls turned to the boy and began to thank him for saving them. They also said that they would never forget the boy's kindness and generosity. Just as Ichijo wanted to answer them, saying that he hadn't really done anything special, the girls' bodies were already headless and were flying towards the ground like two sacks. It was suspiciously quiet and deserted, which created additional fear and a similar atmosphere. This shocked the young man. It was especially hard to watch things like this. Ichijo was stunned and soon began to slowly raise his head up to where the attack had come from. He still didn't understand how this was possible, but soon he saw the toothy mouth of a monster that was chewing something inside. It turned out to be a huge cannibal of level 22. Its statistics were also all greater than Ichijo's. The happy moment did not last long, and the harsh world showed its fangs again. 2 precious lives were lost in this world in a moment like that. The girls' faces continued to appear before Ichijo's eyes, who was now simply overwhelmed with emotion. But things were still bad. Having eaten 2 girls, the monster now intended to deal with the boy who stood before him. His mouth was full of sharp teeth. Ichijo knew that there was no point in even trying to fight this monster, because the level difference was too great for him, 13 units. The guy bared his teeth and understood that there really was no other way out but to run if he wanted to stay alive. Soon, as he walked forward, he saw the lid of one of the garbage bins fly off. However, he did not understand why he continued to stand in place. In the guy's head, there were thoughts that he should run, because he was an ordinary office clerk. But the faces of the 2 girls who had been brutally eaten by this monster kept flashing before his eyes. Ichijo picked up the knife and told himself that he had no intention of escaping. The huge ogre began to entwine the buildings nearby with roots that it released from its hands. Ichijo continued to stand in front of it and watch the approaching monster. The monster began to reach for the boy, gradually opening its mouth. It intended to grab the boy and eat him just like the 2 girls. Ryudo-D began to attack and hit with his stems at the place where Itadzi stood. The guy noticed that the monster had a heavy and fast attack, and if it hits accurately, the young man will die. But Ichijo wasn't going to give up so easily, so he deftly dodged, avoiding the ogre's blows. The boy understood that he would either die or win. Ichijo continued to swing his blade, hitting the monster's tentacles. He knew he was breaking through the ogre's defense, so he had a chance. The monster's defense was really weak, and Ichijo, despite the difference in levels, did not lose his composure at all and was completely concentrated. At one point, Ichijo was already sure that he was winning. But another blow from the monster hit the goblin's knife, which Ichijo picked up, and it broke. Ichijo jumped up and decided that he would attack with his arms. It had defeated the Goblin expedition with them, so with a strengthened body, he could try it on the ogre as well. Right in the young man's path lay 2 metal containers intended for storing garbage. Ichijo shouted that he would crush the monster and immediately struck him on the head. A hole immediately appeared at that place, and the boy thought that this was the end. Ichijo pressed the monster down, and it immediately pressed itself into the ground. The guy smiled and shouted that he had succeeded, but there was no notification yet, which usually appears immediately. From the knot that had formed, a new head immediately emerged, which was directed at Ichijo. The young man was surprised that the monster had such a strong regeneration. He screamed and immediately received a blow to his body, which immediately threw him back. The boy was immediately thrown out of the gateway where Ichijo was fighting with the cannibal, and soon stopped when he hit a large truck that was carrying gasoline. Ichijo couldn't believe he had dominated the entire fight and made such a bad mistake. It was a damn shame after everything he had done. Looking at the people who had already been killed by the monsters, Ichijo continued to be overwhelmed with emotions. This world was damn cruel, and the invasion of monsters had greatly affected it. Despite all this, the boy still couldn't provide adequate protection to those little girls and his manager now. That's why he hasn't given up yet. The boy began to rise to his feet, leaning on the truck next to him. He saw a huge cannibal gradually crawling out from behind the alley and following him. The monster gradually moved forward and spread its roots forward. It let out a terrifying scream that went right to the bone. One of them started making noise and Ichijo immediately headed towards him. But Ichijo still wasn't going to give in and decided that he couldn't give in now. He had already put in a lot of effort. The guy started to lift the huge fuel tanker. Strengthening the body gave really powerful indicators and capabilities. Ichijo tore it off the ground and threw it towards the monster, shouting that it was going to be hot now. A large explosion occurred between the 2 buildings, after which the flames extended for several dozen meters in different directions. The fuel truck hit the cannibals straight away. The buildings were destroyed, and the fire continued to burn. Ichijo noticed that the monster had shrunk quite a bit and was unable to fully regenerate at the moment. There was no way to lose the opportunity, so the guy immediately rushed there. He grabbed the plant and said that even plant monsters were vulnerable to fire. That was the rule of the world. After killing the cannibal, Ichijo's level was increased by 6 units at once and was now 15. Ichijo also received a lot of additional points that could be spent on skills. Afterwards, the boy went to get the bodies of the 2 girls and decided to bury them nearby in the forest. He put a backpack next to their grave, but he knew that he was still too weak. None of this could have happened, because if he had been pumped up and more experienced, he could have saved them. But nothing worked. Ichijo reproached himself for this. After summoning his status, Ichijo immediately raised his body's fortification to level 2 and was ready to fight the 2 wolves that emerged from the trees. Ichijo began to rise from the pit where the Minotaur had driven him. The boy found it hard to breathe, and his whole body felt hot, as if he was burning. He had already exceeded his limits. In his head, the boy said that one day he would definitely save now. At that moment, the girl appeared before his eyes and said that she would wait for that moment. This sentence left Now in complete shock. She screamed, telling the soldier that he was talking about something incomprehensible. The soldier threw up his hands, saying that he would explain everything. He started talking about how the monsters were only getting stronger every day now, because of something called the global reversal factor. Then he turned his gaze to Ichijo and said that this rag could not protect such a girl. The soldier added that the guy was most likely just lucky with the boss. Makimoto pointed his thumb at himself and loudly declared that he was already level 25 and that this indicator was the highest in the entire hospital. He considered himself the strongest here. Makimoto grabbed Nao's hand and said that he was offering the girl a leisurely talk about their future together. The soldier invited Nao to come into his room. Nao was about to object, but at that moment, Ichijo grabbed the soldier's hand without getting up from the hospital bed. The guy said that Nao was already starting to get nervous. Afterwards, Ichijo added that he too might soon become nervous. Smiling at the soldier, the young man said that he would like to ask him to leave his room. The soldier was offended by this interference. He raised his free hand, which he had already clenched into a fist, threatening Ichijo. But the youth gripped the captured limb tighter. Makimoto felt a great pain. He thought that Ichijo would tear his arm off. It was strange that this frail young man had such great strength. Ichijo chuckled and said that he was only level 9. But then his gaze turned angry and Ichijo said to look at his stats. Continuing to run, using his skill, the picture suddenly disappeared, and the guy realized that he needed to pull himself together and concentrate on the moment if he really wanted to save the girl. He remembered the Minotaur's axe, which remained in the ground, covered with pieces of asphalt. It was then that Ichijo realized that he could still change everything. Makimoto's face began to break out in cold sweat. He felt extreme pain and thought that Ichijo would finish him off right here. The soldier looked at the young man pitifully. Ichijo pulled his arm away and let go, apologizing. The boy said that he had only wanted to hold the soldier back slightly, but had misjudged his strength. Makimoto fell to his knees and looked at the floor, sweat continuing to run down his face, and soon the major's order came from behind him, ordering the boy to leave the room. Makimoto rose to his feet and hurried towards the door. As he left, he shouted for them all to go to hell. The major continued to watch the soldier leave. As he left, Karube turned to Ichijo now, asking their forgiveness for being so rude. Ichijo said that he understood and that they should get back to talking. The boy was curious about what request the major wanted to convey to him. Karube said that due to frequent, unforeseen monster attacks, they were in a difficult combat situation. There were also people in the city who saw a figure that looked like another boss monster. If this creature breaks into the hospital, they will not be able to defeat it. Major Karube leaned slightly towards the young man and said that he had come for help. The military man wanted to ask Ichijo to help them defeat this boss. Ichijo watched the whole thing and thought that it was too expected. Now said that, however, it was too cruel for the girl. Now began to defend the boy, saying that Ichijo had fought desperately with that monster, almost met his death, and now he was being called into battle again. Flying past the weapon, the guy grabbed the axe and continued to rush towards the monster. He had to use this chance to move forward already, having completed this task. She explained that the boy's body had not yet recovered from severe wounds and exhaustion. Karube, continuing to bend over, said that this was all he could do now in this situation. The major turned to the boy again, saying that he knew about Ichijo's low level. But despite all this, the boy had incredible indicators and status. The major knelt down and said that he would not even ask about the boy's strength, but would still ask him for help for the sake of the peaceful people who must remain alive. Ichijo sighed heavily as he looked at the military man. He knew that they were asking to borrow his strength, so after thinking for a moment, the boy said that he would agree to take it on. Nao was shocked by this answer. She looked at Ichijo indignantly, and the major, who was starting to get up, left the room, saying that he was grateful from the bottom of his heart. Ichijo thought that besides him, there were no people who can handle such a task as subduing bosses. No matter how much he wanted to become a hero, he was the only one. Nao was upset by this. She bowed her head, sat on the edge of the bed, and repeated that this was all very harsh. The girl was very worried about the boy. After a short silence, she continued, explaining that this was all a mind-boggling, repeating time loop. Even though Ichijo had finally defeated that Minotaur, and now Ichijo is forced to fight another monster again. They demanded this on the day when he just woke up and his body had not yet fully recovered. The girl howled, said that they could have given Ichijo at least a week to rest. After all, he had to endure a real nightmare that lasted for several days. 0.03 of 1 second remained. Ichijo began to raise the blade, letting out a furious cry. He put all his strength into his last blow, hoping that Nao would live. The boy quietly said that now she understood what he was telling her. But Ichijo added that he had already somehow given up hope of fighting the monster, and was ready for humility. However, at that moment, he regained his courage to fight. It was the person who made him realize that Ichijo was not alone in this world, and that person was Nao. The young man looked at Nao and said that he would fight for the reason of ensuring the protection and future of the person who was dearer to him than anyone else in the world. Ichijo also asked Nao not to worry too much about him. He would try to defeat the boss with all his might, and would emerge victorious in the end. After saying this, Nao leaned her elbows on the blanket and said that in that case, she would go with Ichijo to subdue the bosses. The young man was shocked by such a statement. He cried out, trying to object, but the girl said that she understood everything. If the real her went with Ichijo, she would only be a burden on this journey. But despite all this, she really wanted to fight with Ichijo. She said that she couldn't even think about him going to the boss alone because it was definitely wrong. Now looked into Ichijo's eyes and began to beg him to come along. At that moment, the system issued a new notification, unlocking some script. It turned out that Nanas's script, together with you, had appeared. The girl understood the guy's condition and wanted to help him. It was a task that required joining forces with the girl. Ichijo didn't understand anything. He started reading, and it turned out that accepting this script was optional. He had the right to refuse, but for the duration of the mission, the girl would have the resurrection skill. In the last hundredth of a second of the sprint, Ichijo jumped up and cut the Minotaur in half where there was already a hole. The monster opened its mouth, and blood immediately gushed out from there as well. At that moment, the guy did not understand why this script appeared now. The system somehow tracked his life and Ichijo's mood, so it was not by chance that it made such scripts. He looked at all this thoughtfully, and now asked what happened to him. The guy began to explain to her that a window popped up, informing him that a script had been activated. He began to explain everything to the girl, and she assumed that because she intended to help the boy, this very script appeared. Ichijo asked what the girl thought about the proposal. Now said that in the end, even if she died there with him, she could resurrect. And that was just what they needed to defeat the boss. She asked to accept the script. Ichijo began to explain that resurrection is not only an omnipotent force, as she might have thought. Hell awaited the girl, in which she would not be able to die, even if she wanted to. Now said that she guessed everything. But she had already decided on this action, and no matter what Ichijo told her now, she would not back down from her intention under any circumstances. The guy said that she really hadn't been listening to him since he started talking about all this a long time ago. He was upset with the girl's decision. Ichijo thought about it and realized that he couldn't just call now to relive the agony of death that he experienced when he eventually defeated the Minotaur. And in that case, he knew that all he could do was save the girl no matter what it took. Then he said that there would be no turning back if they agreed. After that, the guy accepted the script. He looked at Now and said that from now on, they would act together, and it would be better to use the status and skills they had together. The guy stood there with a bloody face and tried to catch his breath. People continued to look at him without saying a word. Everyone was amazed that the guy managed to defeat the monster. Ichijo had. She said that she now understood the reason for the guy's strength, and they began to study Nao's status. She began to list her abilities, but the young man said that he saw everything and she did not need to bother. With his current level of analysis, he could observe everything himself. Now started waving her hands in front of his eyes, which was quite abrupt. She told Ichijo not to look without her permission, as it was a violation of privacy. Ichijo was indignant, saying that almost anyone can see the status now if they have the analysis. The girl continued, saying that now the status is like personal data, where the height is indicated, and everything else. She was embarrassed to see that even her body measurements were written in the status. The girl explained that she would not be happy about someone peeking there without permission. Ichijo was shocked by such an attack on him. He added that he had not seen all these points at all. Now said that there was no way to protect himself from being peeped at this time. But with all that, the guy should be careful. Otherwise, his situation could only get worse. Then she added that his nickname Bull was enough. The guy was surprised to hear this. He immediately asked again, and then now took out her phone, trying to explain everything. The girl said that on the evening when he defeated the Minotaur, he was immediately put on social media. She showed him the photo and said, "Here he is, a bull, looking perfectly into the camera." Afterwards, Ichijo apologized for peeking at the girl's status without asking. He also expressed that he was embarrassed by this new nickname. Now, on the other hand, didn't understand why Ichijo didn't like it, since she thought it sounded pretty cool. The Minotaur's body lay on the ground. Ichijo had split it in two, and the monster's face was open-mouthed, as its death had occurred instantly. Afterwards, the guy said that he wanted to return to their initial conversation. Now agreed and began to say that she would now tell about the skills that she had managed to obtain. The girl started listing, and among them were body strengthening, magic scheme, and basic level magic. Ichijo started asking about the last point. Now explained that the owner of the entry-level magic skill mastered the shock arrow. The damage of such entry-level magic varied depending on the magic value, and the amount of mastered initial level magic depended on the skill level. The guy said that he didn't expect this. Ichijo thought that the girl would become a musclehead. She tensed up, and then he explained that he was joking. Now explained that she wasn't particularly proud of her physique, but if she had to choose, magic was closer to her than anything else. The guy smiled after such a confession. Then he started asking about the consumption of magic power. It seemed to him that it should decrease as the skills were activated. Now began to explain that the body is hot inside and soon gets tired when you activate and use magic. At that moment, you feel like you are rushing somewhere with all your strength. Also, all of this was used by using up magic power. And the initial level magic is activated by depleting physical power, so you feel extremely tired. Ichijo said that he understood the overall picture. Then he proposed his plan for how to conduct the battle. The boy said that he would go ahead and the girl would cover his back. Ichijo saw that Now was about to object, but he immediately said that his body had recovered. He was better thanks to automatic regeneration, so he would be able to move tomorrow. Now dropped her weapon, which she was standing with in hopes of distracting the Minotaur. She was also surprised that Ichijo saved her from certain death. After all, he only had a few seconds. Afterwards, Now said that the guy needed to rest, so she would go and sleep too. She wished him good night and began to leave the room. Looking back at the guy, Ichijo also wished her good night, watching the girl go. Soon it became completely dark outside, and beautiful and bright stars appeared in the sky, illuminating the sky. After midnight, the global reversal rate increased, stopping at 3.01%. The girl was moving towards the exit of the hospital, past various barricades. With a heavy sigh, she went out into the street, where there were also various barricades made from what the military had managed to bring in during the day. There was various furniture from the hospital and a pile of rubber tires. Suddenly, the girl heard a voice behind her. Major Karube came out of the corner. He said that he was not particularly pleased to see the girl alone outside the hospital and in front of the main entrance. Now smiled and said she just wanted to get some fresh air. The major was on patrol that day, explaining that the monsters were only active at night. Ichido's health. He was very worried about the fate of the guy who could help them in the battle with the bosses. Now crossed her arms and said that Ichijo was getting better, and it seemed like he would be ready tomorrow. She also noted that this guy always put himself in the background. The captain smiled dryly and said that he could see how much the girl really liked Ichijo. He asked Now about it, causing her to blush and become embarrassed. The girl said that this was not so at all. It was just that their fatal connection had been determined in high school. The major said that he saw a very close connection between the boys. Traces began to appear on the girl's eyes. She opened her mouth and was about to say something. At that moment, Ichijo walked towards her to help her up. Here the girl thought about it and began to say something about Ichijo, wanting to share it with the major. When she heard some noise that was heard above her head, the girl turned and saw various furniture and rubber that formed the barricades begin to fall from above. After that, she looked up. At this point, Ichijo was about to go to bed, but his thoughts were bothering him. He knew that right now, at this moment, killing the boss was his priority. The boy thought about the fact that he was no longer alone and reassured himself with this. He understood that now there was a person who wanted to fight side by side with him. At that moment, the system issued a notification. Ichijo immediately opened it and saw that the script had begun to progress. It also said that Nao's death had been confirmed. The guy didn't understand what happened and how it could happen that Nao died. The skill started to activate and the guy slowly started to lose consciousness. So the guy woke up again in the hospital, in a ward. The awakening was very abrupt, and Ichijo himself was scared of what could happen to Nao. He understood that most likely the resurrection was activated. But in that case, the guy had a question. Why was he here, in the ward? After death, shouldn't he return to the very evening when he first discovered your resurrection skill? It turns out that the original resurrection point was changed, and the fact that it moved to today was most likely due to defeating the first boss Ichijo met, Minotaur. Ichijo was overwhelmed with emotion because he was very angry with himself. The boy slightly rose from the bed, realizing that he had promised himself that he would not let Nao die. The crowd perked up a bit. Everyone looked at the guy who was still holding the huge Minotaur axe. They couldn't believe what had just happened before their eyes. Suddenly, the door to the ward opened and a worried girl ran in. Nao shouted the name of the young man, who was already sitting and smiling, seeing her alive. Ichido was really happy to see her and thought that the girl had survived, but now said that she had died that day. That's when the guy realized that the day had started again. Ichijo started asking what had happened, now explained that she wanted to get some fresh air. So she went to stand at the main entrance. Karube came to her and they talked for a while, exchanging news, and then now felt like she was attacked by a monster, which caused her death. Ichijo was surprised that the girl realized the monster was attacking and quickly came to her senses, realizing what was happening. The guy asked about the type of monster that attacked. Just thinking about it, when Now started to remember everything, she immediately started to tremble violently. The girl said that she didn't determine the type of monster because she didn't have time. Ichijo looked at the frightened Now, who continued to shake. Afterwards, the girl said that everything happened in an instant, but there was one thing that she seemed to remember. The monster itself looked like some kind of animal, a terrible one. Big and black. It was like a wolf, covered in fur, and its eyes glowed in the dark. Now said that after that, she found that the main entrance had the same environment as it had just before the boy woke up. That is, she was immediately resurrected after that death. Ichijo thought and scratched his chin. Since it happened like this, the situation really wasn't the best. It could mean that the monsters would attack again tonight. However, he wasn't dead yet, so he was willing to risk everything and not let the monster touch Now under any circumstances. He wouldn't let him take anyone or himself anymore. Various symbols began to circle around Ichijo. The boy received a silver trophy for completing a C-class quest. He defeated the Minotaur and received several privileges. In any case, the probability of an attack was very high. Now apologized for the fact that she died, and he had to return to his previous state again. Ichijo smiled and told Now not to blame herself for it. Now that the resurrection accuracy had changed, the boy had his own thoughts on the matter. The young man added that sooner or later he would have to return to this state anyway, so everything was fine. Now was very worried, and tears began to well up in her eyes. She asked the reason why the starting point had changed. Ichijo himself didn't understand the exact reason. He decided that for now, they should prioritize preparing for the battle with the monster. While Ichijo was looking at the system panel, Now said that she would warn Karube about today's attack. He also thought that this script was much more burdensome than he expected, because now if one of you died, then the resurrection is activated and the second one will also share the same fate. In this restart, in Ichijo's not the best condition played an important role. As expected, Karube came into the room to check on the boy. Now immediately approached him and told him that an attack was planned for tonight. The girl saw that there were a lot of monsters, so she asked that the main entrance be reinforced as much as possible, and the people who would guard it should be on the alert and wait until midnight. Ichijo was still lost in his thoughts. He kept thinking about Now, would have a hard time, and then he decided to pull himself together, realizing that he could protect her. Soon, the door to the ward opened, and Now came back in. She saw that the guy was already standing on his feet and gradually removing the bandages. He was much better, although everything hurt. People began to rejoice, shouting words of approval, and all the girls in the crowd were touched by his courage. The conquest of the Minotaur was confirmed by the system, but they had no choice and had to act. Ichijo stretched and said that before the monster's attack, which would happen in a few hours, he would be able to recover to some extent. Afterwards, he started looking for his things and started getting dressed. Ichijo said that he wanted to take a short walk to stretch his body, and he asked Now to wait for him in the room. The girl agreed and stayed inside. Ichijo went out into the corridor and began to look around. At some point, slowly moving forward, he realized that he seemed to have gotten lost. Soon he came out into one of the halls of his floor and headed towards the elevator. He tried to press the button, looked at them, and realized that it seemed that they had been switched off as an emergency, so that no one would get trapped. After all, the monsters could have cut off the electricity that went to the hospital. Ichijo also noticed that every time he went to hospitals, he was always wrong. But before these monsters arrived, he had time. He needed to study the hospital well and understand what advantages he had in his further fight. Suddenly, Ichijo heard a noise that arose from the lower floors. The boy stopped and began to listen, not understanding what was the cause of such a rumble. After that, people started screaming in the hospital. All the patients opened their doors out of curiosity and started to inquire about the source because it could be an alarm. Ichijo walked towards the noise and soon saw a man who was exhausted coming up the stairs to their floor. He ran here with all his might and then started shouting that monsters had entered the hospital. Ichijo was shocked by the information he heard. He knew that the monsters were supposed to attack in a few hours, which had not yet passed. While Ichijo was looking around, the system also announced that the speed of the global reversal progression was decreasing. The overall level was raised from 30 to 38. The guy started running up to the man, who, having climbed the stairs, immediately fell to his knees and continued shouting, calling on those who could to go and fight. After Ichijo asked where the monsters were now, the man replied that he saw them in the lobby, in front of the main entrance of the hospital. Before they could even react, they were besieged by black wolves. Ichijo realized that these were the same black wolves that had attacked now. The man informed him that the self-defense forces guys were fighting them now, but there were many more opponents. Ichijo immediately rushed to the main entrance to help while there were still people alive. He thought that the attack might have started prematurely because they told the others. It was strange that this could affect the course of action of the monsters that attacked earlier. Ichijo ran as fast as he could, knowing that he had to hurry anyway. Meanwhile, all the soldiers from Major Karubi's detachment were holding the makeshift fences that the monsters were breaking into. They had been holding it for about half an hour and were running out of strength. Someone from the line shouted that they could no longer hold the fence because it was useless. Major Karub called on everyone to continue holding the fence. But there really were many more monsters, and they were huge. No matter how the guys from the Japanese self-defense held out, the outcome was obvious. The wolves continued to rock the makeshift fence, and soon began to run and push it with the weight of their entire bodies. At some point, they managed to break through and rushed inside. The army's barricade was breached. They quickly began to grab their weapons to fight back. The wolves continued to penetrate the lobby of the main entrance. It was all over, and it seemed that Ichijo himself could not believe it. He closed his eyes and calmly inhaled the air, enjoying his triumph and victory. One of the monsters jumped on Major Karubi, who was holding the fence with the others. At that moment, he had already managed to grab the rifle and cover himself with it, and the wolf bit the weapon with his teeth. The Major was not a timid guy, so after struggling with the monster for a while, he swung and threw the beast with all his might. After that, the Major was already standing on his feet. The wolf jumped back from the strong Major in fear, several meters away. Karube bent down, picking up the rifle he had dropped, and began to look around. At first he thought that they had escaped and would be able to correct themselves. Then he turned to his squad and ordered everyone to line up, because the moment was critical. But when he started to say this, he could not finish, because he saw that almost his entire squad was killed. The black wolves were cutting the soldiers to pieces, tearing them to pieces. The monsters spared absolutely no one and left the soldiers no chance to survive. Death was quite painful, as the beasts simply bit into the soldiers' flesh and opened up chunks of it. Karube thought that everything was much better, but after what he saw, he realized that their resistance was useless. They could not cope with this army of wolves. They were overwhelming them with numbers and level. In this situation, they had no chance of winning from the start. It was clear that the monsters were really progressing. But even so, the Major was not going to give up. He stood firmly on his feet and shouted that he would not let the monsters get in. The monsters rushed at the Major, and he understood that this could only buy a little time for the remaining people. The wolves began to bite into the Major's body, and he was ready to accept his death. At that moment, Ichijo arrived and kicked several wolves back towards the entrance. This moment of solitude was interrupted by Now, who shouted the boy's name. He opened his eyes, turned his head, and saw the girl walking towards him. Major Karube raised his eyes in surprise and saw the same young man he had visited in the ward today. It was indeed Ichijo, who had come to support the soldiers. Ichijo walked forward a little and stood in front of the Major. Afterwards, the boy turned his head and apologized to Karuba for being late. Now the situation could be entrusted to him. Karube raised his head, still not believing what he saw. The monsters were damn strong, and this guy took out 3 black wolves with just one kick. The next moment, the wolves retreated a little, and a heavy and dull knock began to be heard in the neighboring wall. Soon the wall was broken through, and debris began to fly in different directions. Karube continued to sit on the floor, and Ichijo looked at the one who crawled out of that hole in the wall. The guy was quite relaxed. which was shown by the fact that his hands were in his pants pocket. He looked at the enormous wolf, which was several times larger than all the others. It had 3 heads, like Cerberus. Ichijo headed towards it, realizing that it was a boss that would be good for a warm-up. Now heard that something was going on at the hospital, so she immediately rushed to the main entrance to help. She knew that Ichijo was still alive, because otherwise the day would have started again. After going down the stairs, the girl continued to run and turning the next corner. She saw Horobu lying on the ground. There were several more soldiers around him, standing and watching. The girl immediately rushed to the major, and when she ran up, she immediately asked how the man was feeling. The major said that it was dangerous to go further. He tried to stand up, showing a desire to take the girl away. He said that Ichijo was currently fighting in the main lobby. The girl, hearing this, immediately turned her head towards the entrance. He didn't look his best. His entire office suit was tattered and torn. The guy himself was covered in dirt and blood, and the abrasions were painful when the guy wanted to show any emotion. A black wolf with 3 heads, which apparently was the main boss. The monster tried to knock Ichijo down with its paw, but the guy was quite agile, so he managed to dodge it. The wolf used his entire arsenal. 3 toothy heads also tried to catch the young man with their teeth, but Ichijo used sprint, exhausting the monster. The 2 soldiers, meanwhile, were watching the battle and were amazed at the ferocious attacks the monster was making. They thought that something had to be done before the young man died too. At some point, Ichijo saw another powerful blow flying towards him. The paw flew and at some point slapped the place where the young man who was fighting the wolf stood. The wolf's mouth was drooling. He continued to bare his teeth and kept his paw where he had struck. Dust rose up around him and stones began to fly, breaking off from the floor. The shockwave also hit the soldiers who were standing nearby and watching the battle. They covered themselves with their hands to keep all the debris from the permit from getting into their eyes. When the dust stopped flying towards them and cleared, the soldiers saw that the wolf still had its paw on the ground. They thought that Ichijo had died, which meant the end for the rest. After that, the paw began to gradually rise upward, and it was not the wolf that was lifting it, but someone's hand. Karabayan now opened their mouths in surprise, realizing that Ichijo was still alive. The boy's body sank into the floor, but Ichijo remained firmly standing on straight legs. The boy held the wolf's paw with only one of his hands, which Karube did not believe at first. Ichijo smiled, thinking that he still had no objections to the value of his stamina, which he had increased back in the ward. Ichijo took a few small steps forward towards the girl and began to exhale with difficulty, saying her name. He began to say that he was glad that the girl was alive. As it turned out, it changed with the increase in body strengthening and increased by as much as 50 points. Now it remains to check the muscular strength, which also increased. Ichijo froze for a few seconds, and then quietly asked the wolf if he was the one who killed Now last time. The young man wanted to teach this monster a lesson. Because of him, the boy couldn't keep his word. Ichijo pushed off, jumped up and rushed towards the 3-headed wolf, aiming his fist at him. Ichijo said that now it was the beast's turn to die. Reaching the wolf, the boy hit it in the neck, causing it to cry out. Drops of blood flew from the wolf's mouth. The blow was so powerful that it most likely destroyed the monster from the inside. The wolf was defeated and fell to the floor, and Ichijo continued to stand next to its body. The soldiers couldn't believe his victory. They were amazed that the guy could actually defeat this monster. The soldiers began to rejoice, saying that the young man was very cool. Afterwards, they began to encourage Ichijo, shouting at him to go ahead and deal with all the other wolves who had killed their fellow soldiers. Ichijo stood there, looking at the remaining wolves who had begun to gather into a small group. Now noticed that after the battle with the 3-headed wolf, something was wrong. Looking closely, the girl saw that Ichijo had injured his arm in the battle. It was the arm that had dealt the boss a strong blow, and blood was dripping down from it. The wolves began to bare their teeth, and Ichijo said that they were next in line. But things were bad, because the wounds were much worse than he thought. But at some point, before he could finish the sentence, Ichijo began to fall backwards. Now, who managed to run up in time, caught the guy and hugged him tightly. The enemy was indeed tough. But the hardest part, in Ichijo's opinion, was already over. The wolves began to slowly approach the guy, growling menacingly and baring their teeth. At some point, the wolves began to retreat. Ichijo sensed something was wrong. Everyone else watched as the young man stood in place at a distance. At that moment, Ichijo realized that he felt an oppressive atmosphere that made his hair stand on end. The same feeling he had experienced when he fought the Minotaur. Afterwards, Ichijo understood everything at once. He turned towards the three-headed wolf and realized that it was not the leader, but nothing more than a small fry who was sent to attack and scout out the situation. Despite all this, after the victory there were no notifications from the system like last time. Ichijo realized that there was someone who was subjugating the other wolves. And in that case, it was a boss monster with the appearance of a wolf. Not so far from the hospital, a large werewolf with glowing eyes sat on a water tower. It was even bigger in size than the three-headed wolf. The guy realized that if the boss himself came, he wouldn't have even a small chance to win with such injuries. Ichijo knew he had to change his plan somehow. At that moment, the wolves began to disperse throughout the lobby and began to grab the bodies of the soldiers who had died in the battle with them. After they grabbed them, they immediately ran out through the main passage at great speed. The soldiers came up and asked about the howl that was heard in the street. They did not understand what it was and thought that it was all over now. One of the soldiers said that these black, massive wolves ran like cowardly dogs when Ichijo killed their leader. Now couldn't hold back her tears and started to sob. She couldn't believe that all this had happened to him. The girl felt sorry for Ichijo because he was so exhausted. The guy grinned and said that nothing was over yet. They just took their food, and the howling that was heard on the street was a kind of signal to come back. The soldiers began to approach the bodies of the dead. In this battle, 7 people from the self-defense forces were killed and there were wounded. Ichijo understood that the wolves could return at any moment. If you count the people who can fight, it seems to be less than half. The average level of a wolf was about 18. It was necessary to kill the monsters that raided the hospital as soon as possible. They all needed to be killed. The only saving grace was that their strength hadn't changed much, even though their reversal rate had increased. Ichijo checked his stats. However, the boy realized that increasing the percentage did not always mean that the monster's strength would also increase. Now ran up to the boy and apologized for not helping him. Ichijo began to calm the girl down. When Now came close, she turned and pointed at the three-headed wolf. She also thought it was the boss, but Ichijo said it was just a small fry. Besides all of them, there was also a boss who was much stronger. The guys did not understand why the wolves started attacking so early. Perhaps they were initially preparing to attack this hospital. Now continued to look at the boy's hand, and Ichijo said that from next time on it would be better to act as much as possible as last time, so as not to change the enemy's course of action. Now ran up and said that she realized that it was more important to take care of the boy's health now, since his fist was badly injured. Ichijo said that he would be fine. After all, he had automatic regeneration. With all this, the guy understood that it would be difficult to fight only with blows. It was necessary to find some kind of weapon. She knelt down slightly and placed Ichijo's head on her lap. The boy turned to her and said that he really wanted to tell her something, and that she, in turn, should listen to him. Suddenly, he saw a man in a hooded sweater sitting next to the carcass of a dead wolf. In his hand was a knife, with which he was trying to cut up the wolf. Ichijo asked Now who that person was. Now said it was Kashiwabu, and it seemed like she was collecting materials from monsters using the dissection skill. It was then that Ichijo realized that various games often use various materials that can be collected from enemies. These materials could be used to create weapons and armor. After that, the boy realized that the man in the sweater might have skills that would be useful to him. Ichijo rushed towards the material collector and Now stayed behind. When Ichijo came closer, he first apologized and then addressed the man, calling him Kashiwabu. The man was startled and quickly jumped up from his seat, exclaiming softly. It turned out to be a little girl with blonde hair. She took off her hood, put the knife on the ground, and said that Ichijo had scared her when he came up from behind. Ichijo was very surprised that a child was cutting on monsters. He asked the girl if she was okay, to which she nodded her head. The girl was no less surprised, her eyes and mouth wide open. She pointed her finger at the young man and then exclaimed that there was a bull boy in front of her. The girl apologized in response and asked about the boy's name. She asked about what business Ichijo had with her. The boy asked about the materials the girl was collecting. Ichijo smiled and said that he only wanted to ask about the possibility of creating armor or weapons for him. He realized that he could not fight effectively with his bare hands. there was only 1 second left that he could still use to sprint. In that remaining moment, he rushed at the monster, scattering stones from the pit in different directions. He wanted to tell her what had happened before. He looked at the girl, paused for a moment, and said that first they would go and have a drink somewhere together. The girl froze in place and raised her hand to her face. She froze and began to think, and after a couple of minutes she said that she did not have the skill for making yet. It turned out that she was looking at her ability panel, but Ichijo thought that this girl sometimes got lost in her thoughts. He said that it was time for him to go. The girl stood still, and when Ichijo had already turned his back to her, she said that it was very strange. After all, they called him a bull, so she thought he was using an axe. Ichijo turned sharply and thought that he really did have an axe that he had completely forgotten about. With the Minotaur's axe, the guy really should be able to withstand the strengthened boss. The girl said that most likely the axe was still lying in the place where the guy killed the boss. On top of that, that axe had a high numerical value. Ichijo didn't understand what indicator she was talking about, but Kashinubu explained that in the world that had changed, weapons also had their own status. That's why the girl was talking about it. Ichijo was very surprised when he learned that the axe had its own status. He decided that he needed to find out as much as possible about it, so he turned back to the girl. The girl continued to hold the knife in her hands and began to explain that if you have the expertise skill and you can use it, then you can find out the digital value of any weapon. She gave an example, saying that, for example, the pistols used by the self-defense forces had a value that increased the character's striking power by 2 units. Ichijo was still amazed. He asked about the axe and its statistics. The girl fell silent and began to remember. Afterwards, she said that she did not remember exactly, but the indicators were like this. Looking at the night sky, the boy again received several notifications that the disorder imprinted in the soul was overcome. The boy received a special skill that was added to the resurrection skill. The fierce bull cleaver had a weapon recommendation of 80 muscle power. The striking power was 75, and the weapon durability value was 37. The weapon effect could not be known. The guy thought about it, thinking that with an impact force of 75 units, it was a very strong increase in muscular strength, because in that case, the value became 165. He also understood that he would have no problems with the effects on the weapon. Afterwards, the guy thanked the girl, who, putting on a hood, said that she was glad to help. Ichijo decided it was time for him to go get an axe. The boy added that now, when he got some kind of weapon, he could bring it to the girl for evaluation. Kashinunu said that she did not have the expertise skill. Ichijo was surprised by this answer, because in that case he did not understand the reason why she knew all this. The girl said that one of the self-defense forces had this skill, and she heard about it completely by accident. However, this soldier was already dead. Kashinubu also said that she plans to acquire skills related to manufacturing over time. She added that if she is still useful, then she will be able to give a discount. Ichijo told the girl not to push herself too hard. Afterwards, he realized that people who don't want to fight can develop in another direction and devote themselves to crafting. At the same time, the young man realized that if Kashinubu were to create and improve weapons and armor, this would significantly increase her combat effectiveness and suitability in his new world. Ichijo's train of thought was interrupted by Nao, who approached him with her hands behind her back. The young man saw that something was wrong, so he asked what was wrong. As a result of the invasion of monsters in their country, government institutions began to disintegrate. The number of victims that began to appear in the country has already exceeded 3 million people. Nao came closer and said that Ichijo had already managed to become friends with the girl. She reproached him for the fact that Ichijo could afford to court a girl at such a time. Ichijo raised his hands and began to justify himself, saying that he was only learning about the girl's ability to collect materials and make various weapons and armor from them. Afterwards, he laughed and said that now the boy was going to go get the Minotaur's axe. Ichijo was about to tell the girl to wait for him here again. Nao bowed her head and said that Ichijo was changing the subject again. But the boy explained that he had no other intention than to learn about crafting things. Afterwards, Nao said that she would go too, because she wanted to level up. The guy said that it would be better for her to rest, and that leveling up could be postponed until tomorrow. Nao pointed her finger at the young man and accused him of being the one who said that it would be better for them to act together, and now he was telling her to stay. The girl got offended and said that the guy would prefer Kashinubu's company. She didn't care, so she said that she would level up on her own and alone. In the end, they set off together anyway. When they arrived at the city, Ichijo said that only 3 days had passed, and everything was already in ruins. They had to move with extreme caution. Suddenly, something dangerous caught Nao's eye. The guy immediately covered Nao and shouted for her to move back a little. Then he pointed at one of the electric poles. Ichijo said that in such an area and broken electric poles, there could be boa constrictors. There are also traces of wild boars raging here. That is, monsters and all of them could be nearby. 2 guys were sitting by a ruined wall. They were also exhausted from fighting. At some point, one of the guys asked the other what level he was on. Ichijo said that the girl was getting too close to Konbini, so he was worried that someone might attack her from a blind spot. Nao said that the guy was being too cautious. Ichijo explained that his caution was heightened because there were many monsters in the city that were of a higher level than theirs. And there were a couple of other facts as well. Besides, Ichijo said that the monster couldn't be killed with just the gun that Nao had brought with her. As it turned out, it gave a very small boost to combat power. Nao said that it would simply be easier for her to aim if she had a weapon of that type, so that she could then determine the direction in which she wanted to use her magic. Afterwards, she pointed the gun at Ichijo with a smile and said that the magic shot from the gun sounded pretty cool. Ichijo told her not to point the gun at him. Ichijo said that the probability of that was very low, he thought. The guys from the army couldn't hold that axe even with 4 of them, so he thought that it was still there. And as they approached the place where Itadzi had fought with the Minotaur, they immediately saw this weapon stuck in the ground. There was just one small problem. As it turned out, there were a lot of different huge birds near this place. They built their nests, using the city's skyscrapers as support. The guy said it was too dangerous because of them, because they weren't normal birds. Apparently they were rocks, which could spray sticky liquid from their mouths to slow down the enemy's movements. The guy said 7, and the other guy had 6. They didn't know if they would survive, discussing it. One of them said it would be nice if they made friends with that bull. In addition, she was very difficult to hit because she was constantly flying, and if she was hit, her skin was so tough that Ichijo would most likely break his fist. That's why the boy didn't want to fight her. Nao asked about how if it was hard for him to fight such an opponent, she had a solution she wanted to suggest. Ichijo stopped her and said that these birds were no match for Nao. He added that he could handle it himself somehow, and that she needed to sit quietly and hide here. Ichijo decided that he would also avoid direct combat. He flew out of the bushes and rushed towards the axe, using his sprint skill to quickly reach the weapon. As the boy ran, he saw that he was being closely followed. The rocks were already watching their target, which would serve as nutritious food for their chicks. Suddenly, something froze Ichijo's movement. He almost reached the axe, but at some point he realized that he could not move at all, and move from the spot. When the boy tilted his head down, he was horrified, because he saw the very same liquid that the rook birds scattered to catch their bait. Afterwards, Ichijo realized that he had fallen into the birds' trap. He realized that he had acted too quickly, because who would have thought that they had already scattered their vomit, using the axe as bait. A few minutes later, several ugly and feathered monsters were already circling around the dark-haired youth. At that moment, their chicks screamed even louder from their nests. Ichijo thought that he was in an unavoidable situation and had already said goodbye to his life, since there were many more monsters. But soon he heard Nao's scream, urging him to duck. The man in the white shirt didn't understand what bull they were talking about. The second one started explaining that it was the guy everyone had been talking about since the monsters appeared. The girl ran towards Ichijo, but at some point she tripped awkwardly and fell to the ground. Ichijo began to shout at her that she was going to her certain death with her actions, but Nao yelled back that Ichijo was underestimating her by trying to protect her all the time. She soon took out her gun and said that she could fight too. Pointing her weapon at one of the rocks, the girl used her elemental magic to summon a shock arrow. Nao's magic fired a very powerful shot, striking the monster. Ichijo continued to sit in the bird vomit on the ground. He was very surprised that the initial magic had such a strong striking power and was able to even kill the monster. After that, the rest of the monsters began to fly away, frightened by the girl. They did not even take their chicks from the nests, but quickly rushed away. Ichijo smiled and said that he took back his words and apologized to Nao. Today the girl really saved the 2 of them and proved that she can stand up for herself. Afterwards, Ichijo began to approach the fierce bull's cleaver, which glowed slightly in the dark. While staring, the guy almost lost his vigilance, not noticing the bird behind him. One of the rocks desperately charged to protect its bait. Ichijo knew that the stamina value of these monsters was very high. The next moment, Ichijo reached for the axe. He pulled it out of the ground with one easy movement, and knew that with this weapon, he wouldn't care about this indicator. The rock bird had already come very close to Ichijo, and was about to attack, opening its beak. It also pulled out its clawed feet, but the young man cut it in half with a cleaver. He rummaged around in his pants a bit and said he was going to show me who he was talking about. After poking around in his phone a bit, the guy found what he needed and showed it to the other guy. Blood flew in all directions, some of it landing on Ichijo, who just smiled and said that it was exactly what he needed in that battle at the hospital. Looking at his new tool in the fight against monsters, Ichijo proudly declared that it was the same fierce bull cleaver. With it, the guy's muscle strength increased by 75 points. The rocks began to slowly return, making disgusting noises with their beaks. Now ran closer and asked how Ichijo was feeling. The taller guy raised his axe and said that he would exhaust the birds, and now would deal the final blow to the monsters. Here, he planned to raise the girl's level. Ichijo didn't really think that the day would ever come when he would fight alongside Now. Back then he thought that everything was going well and he could handle it on his own. However, as it turned out, everything was changing at a furious speed. The monsters were becoming stronger and turning the city into a bloody mess. Soon there might be nothing left of it. Ichijo and Now moved through the city. They encountered various monsters along the way. In the fight with the wolves, Ichijo showed off his axe, which was much easier to handle. Having killed a pack of black monsters, the guy stood in place to check their statuses. Now asked if it was the last wolf, and Ichijo looked around and said that it seemed so. The girl looked at her status. The battles were exhausting her, and she was shaking slightly. Her level was currently 23. Ichijo said that she had risen quite well here. They were doing well, and they were also leveling up, especially for Now, who needed to level up as much as possible to stand up to the black wolves. Of course, we were talking about Ichijo. After he defeated a godlike creature by chopping it up with a huge axe, everyone started calling him Bull Boy. Now said that, however, they were the only ones who continued to attack, and the wolves were more than enough ferocity. Ichijo was also tired, and said that they had already killed about 20. They actively attacked the guys, and this was the effect of the received trophy of hostility from the wolf race. Moreover, the guy received the Wolf Killer, which increased hostility by 40, but the increased hostility gave them an advantage, because the enemies willingly went their way. After all, they wanted to quickly raise their levels, so everything went well. Now came closer to Ichijo and leaned on him. The guy immediately recognized how she was feeling. It was obvious that she was tired, but the girl herself said that she was tired. But the girl herself said that she was fine. He remembered that the girl had used too much vitality and stamina due to magic. Ichijo suggested taking a short break, not far from this place. Now drank some water, and said that she was still amazed by that axe, because it was so sharp that the wolves were like butter to it. Ichijo said that he himself saw this when he started using the axe. It was a completely different weapon power than the one in the previous reality. Ichijo began to swing the axe, thereby frightening Now. The young man added that if you swing the axe to its fullest, you can go to the boss with a calm soul. But on the other hand, there was another point. If one of their guys died, they would have to go after him again. And this was quite a tiring task. But then Ichijo had a brilliant idea. He remembered the inventory and decided that if he moved it there, he would be able to use the item after his resurrection. Afterwards, looking around, the guy with the phone exhaled. He said that there was hope that the Bull Boy was still in this city and fighting. Now noted that the boy was very enthusiastic. She turned to Ichijo and said that they could continue to level up, since she had already recovered her strength. Now said that they needed to finish here quickly. Then, from around the corner, they heard a man's screams, which immediately caught their attention. Both turned around and began to look towards the city streets. Now turned her head to Ichijo and said that it seemed like someone was being attacked by monsters. She said that it would be better to go help that unfortunate person. Afterwards, Ichijo looked at her and agreed. He thought that he himself would never throw a person to die. it was decided that they would go to meet him. Heading towards the screams, Ichijo told the girl that helping without fully understanding the situation was also dangerous. It was important to be vigilant. After walking a couple of 100 meters, they turned into a narrow gateway. Ichijo walked ahead and said that it seemed like the sound was coming from here. Soon a guy ran out from around the corner, hit Ichijo, and immediately jumped back. The guy had a very strong body, reinforced by the axe, so he didn't even feel the collision. Ichijo said that the man scared him, and then began to ask if he was okay, but he just silently continued to get up and ran further away from that alley. When he ran away, he shouted that they were just getting in the way, but he was running away. Now and Ichijo didn't understand what the man was talking about at all. He looked like a madman. The boy started running further, and Ichijo said that something was definitely wrong with him. The boy assumed that he was the one they had heard when they took a break a block away. After Ichijo defeated the Minotaur, he then lost consciousness and came to in the city hospital. He opened his eyes and saw Nao cutting an apple, but Nao walked a little further and looked into the passage from which the man ran out. She immediately called Ichijo and pointed her finger at him in the direction of that gateway. Ichijo came closer, and they heard a noise that was getting closer to them. Soon, a huge crowd of various monsters appeared from afar, running towards them. Ichijo and Nao were very scared by what they saw. They did not understand what this monstrous gathering of monsters was. The young man shouted for Nao to follow him. Ichijo had already rushed to the side, but at that moment, Nao fell to her knees and began to cry. The girl screamed that she could not stand up or move at all. The crowd was getting closer and closer. The monsters were rushing with such speed and in such a group that some of the larger ones were crushing and throwing the smaller monsters. Ichijo ran towards Nao, who continued to sit in place and silently, with her mouth open, watched the approaching monsters. Running towards her, Ichijo immediately grabbed Nao and was about to use a sprint to break away from the crowd of monsters. But the monsters did not stop. They continued to run. They swallowed the boys, and at that moment, one of the monsters knocked the girl out of Ichijo's hands. The young man turned back. He stretched out his hand towards the girl, shouting her name. At this time, her body was already being torn apart by a huge black wolf, and Itidzi only heard her ringing, feminine screams. The crowd of monsters continued to move forward, stopping at nothing. Ichijo knew that as long as Nao was alive, he couldn't leave her here alone. The sprint was already ending, and the Minotaur continued to slowly approach and stretch his hand towards Nao, who stood with a crowbar and screamed in fear, shaking completely. Ichijo declined the fruit, telling Nao to eat it. As she continued peeling the apple, the girl said that they were hard to come by now, and that they should enjoy it while they could. The boy used sprint and headed against the crowd, rushing to help Nao. His body was also wounded, but he continued to run despite this. Ichijo moved along the wall and soon stopped in front of where Nao was. He jumped towards her and extended his hand to the girl who was screaming loudly. Her body was wounded, and she began to stretch her hand in response. Suddenly, a giant wasp flew past and pierced the girl with its sting. Ichijo knew he hadn't made it. His eyes were wide open, but there was only emptiness inside. He slowly began to lose consciousness and fall into the crowd. The script Together With You was activated again and continued to progress. Nao's death was confirmed by the system, and the skill Resurrection was activated. The boy came to in the hospital. He immediately got up from the bed and realized that Nao was not next to him. Ichijo jumped up and started walking towards the exit of the ward. They had been through a very difficult moment, and Ichijo understood what the girl might be going through. He had told her from the start that it would be pure hell. Ichijo continued to move down the hallway, calling out the girl's name. Her room was 703, and he soon came to the door. The boy stood there silently for a while. Ichijo came through the door, asking how the girl was feeling. She recognized him, and then Ichijo said that he would open the door now and come in. But as soon as he reached his hand towards the door, he heard a loud "stop" from inside the room. Afterwards, Nao told him to leave her alone. The guy pulled the blanket over himself a little and thanked the girl. She smiled back and continued working on the apple. The lively hum of patients could be heard in the corridor. Ichijo didn't go in. That incident had a strong impact on their further communication, because that incident broke Nao's psyche. From that moment on, Nao's head was filled with terrible memories of you from the very moment when they were attacked by a crowd of monsters. The girl felt terrible pain. The girl continued to scroll through all of this, and around her, she could hear the screams of soldiers who were fighting the monsters that had attacked during the day. Cold sweat was running down Nao's face. The soldiers were fighting off an attack on the hospital that had happened earlier in the day. Major Karub covered the girl with his body and asked what was happening to her. Nao couldn't move because she was so scared. Before Ichijo woke up, she remembered that she died again and the resurrection was activated again. Afterwards, she tried to get to her feet, realizing that the battle had to continue. At that moment, one of the giant wasps headed towards the girl. She immediately remembered the moment when the wasp pierced her with its sting. The girl's eyes widened, and she again fell into a strong panic that paralyzed her body. After this, the girl sat down on the ground again and covered her head with her hands. Seeing this, Major Karube ran up to her and ordered that the girl be taken to a safe place as quickly as possible. Several civilians led her through the hospital corridors and left her in room 703, where Ichijo arrived later. She sat on the bed and grabbed her knees with her hands, still shaking. The moment of death flashed before her eyes again and again. Nao was about to scream, but then she covered her mouth with her hand, trying to hold back her emotions. Ichijo began to remember that very day when he fought the Minotaur. From that moment, it seemed to him, he lay in bed for 2 days straight without getting up. Ichijo started to get up from the bed. The young man realized that he had let Nao die again. This made him very angry because he knew what he was getting the girl into. Ichijo clutched the blanket on his bed tightly and told himself that he probably couldn't protect her. But he couldn't stop trying. Suddenly, he raised his head as someone entered the room. It was Major Karube. After all, he repeated himself again, and the military man apologized and began introducing himself to the guy again, telling him who he was. Ichijo immediately remembered that Karube was supposed to come to his room that evening. He remembered that this was the beginning of the first day when he was with Nao, and he activated the script. Afterwards, Ichijo immediately realized that the events were now repeating themselves without any discrepancies. Therefore, the attack of the Black Wolves should have begun in the evening. Major Karube looked into one corner of the room and asked the boy about the power he had. He thought it was in the object next to the boy. Ichijo immediately turned his head and understood what the military major was talking about. Karube also recognized the weapon and said that it was the same axe with which the boy had defeated the Minotaur. Ichijo was seen, and the major added that the object appeared shortly before the young man woke up. Ichijo didn't even pay attention, and most likely the weapon was placed in the inventory. Then he told the major that this was his strength. Hope appeared, and Ichijo realized that it was too early to give up. He got out of bed and headed for the exit. He told the major that he was going to take down the boss because it was necessary to do what had to be done. He also warned the major that there would be a wolf attack that evening, and the people should leave the lobby. From what Nao had said, the hospital they were in was being defended by the country's self-defense forces with all its might, and, judging by everything, it was in a relatively safe condition. The first thing Ichijo did was go to the room where Nao was now. He had to check on her and talk to her because he completely understood what she was feeling right now. He knocked on the door and said he was coming in, warning Nao. When Ichijo entered, he saw the girl sitting in a blanket on the floor, huddled in the corner of the room. She continued to tremble, and Ichijo sat down on the bed next to her. The guy said that he was sorry because he could not protect her, and everything could have turned out completely differently. Nao said that Ichijo didn't have to apologize to her, because it was all her fault. She admitted that she was the one who got into all this, and she didn't have the strength. The girl also blamed herself for putting Ichijo in danger. Nao accepted that the guy was very cool, because he himself had already died so many times and got up every time. Nao began to cry, admitting that she couldn't cope anymore. When she saw monsters, she immediately remembered what happened before her death. She was afraid of them and couldn't fight. After these words, Ichijo got up from the bed and went to Nao. He bent down and covered her with a blanket, and then began to gently stroke the girl, trying to calm her down. He said that she didn't have to fight him anymore. He would finish it himself, because he couldn't stand to see Nao suffer and shudder in fear anymore. He couldn't let her die anymore, but there was one detail. In order to remove the resurrection from her, it was necessary to complete the script for defeating the boss together. It was for this reason that she only had to help him at the very end, when he would bring everything to victory. As he left, he added that until then, she could relax. Thanks to the internet users, who could still use it on the first day, they were among the first to realize the existence of level and status, and it was now considered normal. He left now alone in the room, and as he walked down the corridor, he realized that fighting himself was the right decision, because that's what he had done before. Ichijo didn't want the girl to suffer more each time. It was hard for him to watch how this fear was killing the girl mentally and not allowing her to live a normal life. Afterwards, Ichijo began to analyze what had happened. The massive monsters that had attacked them in the alley were connected to what had caused the black wolves to attack the hospital. Perhaps the appearance of a monster in the city that was the boss and controlled the black wolves somehow prompted the surrounding monsters to flee, which led to such a cluster. Ichijo continued walking towards the main entrance, still thinking, when he saw that there were still people in the lobby. He rushed towards them, telling them to quickly leave. After these words, the two boys turned around and looked at the young man with the stain. It was Makimoto, who came on the first day. The boy stood with a cigarette in his mouth. His companion turned to Ichijo and asked who he was. Ichijo continued, explaining that in a few minutes a pack of black wolves would appear, so it was best to leave. Makimoto had a terrible character, so when he turned around, he called the guy the unfortunate fool that Karube had praised so much. Ichijo continued to look at the soldier with determination. Makimoto took a few steps towards Ichijo, extending his hand towards him. His comrades stood there laughing, expecting the angry Makimoto to teach the boy a lesson. Makimoto said that some weakling really has no right to tell him what to do, and raised his fist to hit the boy. After that, a black wolf burst through the window and headed towards the boys. Remembering this, the boy slowly began to raise his head and called out to Nao, who was sitting next to him. He wanted to talk to her about the levels and what he had learned. Makimoto only managed to turn his head, and when he saw what had happened, he immediately covered his head and shielded himself from the fragments. Ichijo continued to stand firmly in place, letting the monster pass in front of him. Afterwards, Ichijo quickly grabbed the monster and threw it into a pile of makeshift barricades. Makimoto watched all this while still lying on the ground. Ichijo turned to him with a terrifying look. Blood was slowly trickling down the boy's face from a wound on his cheek. The young man said menacingly that anyone who did not want to die should leave. At this time, a team led by Karu brushed towards the noise. The major said that no one should let down their guard, encouraging his team that they would definitely survive. Afterwards, they saw the guy who had already dealt with the first wolf at that moment. Karubi, seeing this, said that it was the fight of a man who could defeat the boss, as if he himself was Satan. After killing all the wolves, Ichijo turned his gaze to the last one. He was shaking, and the young man told him to run away quickly because he had left the monster alive on purpose. Itzy did this on purpose. He hoped that the wolf would lead him to his boss's lair, where the young man could leave all this torture for himself and now. After some time, the wolf returned to its lair, and Ichijo was able to track it down. The guy saw that it was a descent into the subway, the entrance of which was all stained with blood. Ichijo walked up to the stairs that led down and began to peer into the darkness. He had no idea how strong the boss that was waiting for him there would be, but there was no other option. This had to be finished as soon as possible to stop the torment that Nao was experiencing. Ichijo began to go down. Nao had already fallen asleep by that time, having spent all that time at Ichijo's bedside without getting any proper sleep. She apologized for being distracted, saying that she was fine. Passing the stairs, Ichijo continued walking along the dark corridor and soon saw a wide lobby where there was still light. There were no monsters nearby yet. A small grocery store appeared on the way. The food inside was untouched, and there were many dead people nearby who most likely wanted to get there. The number of corpses increased exponentially along Ichijo's path, and he also felt that unfortunate feeling, a certain aura, similar to the one he experienced during the battle with the Minotaur. Further ahead of the guy was a descent even lower. He looked down the stairs and saw the wolf he had been watching. The monster was following further into the depths of the catacombs. The wolf went straight down to the station and walked a little further. Then he stopped in the middle of the station and began to howl, shaking his head in different directions. Soon many other black wolves began to approach him, which at once became about 20 or 30. This was definitely their lair, and there could be no mistake. The wolves began to gather in one big group and joined the wolf who had come, raising their heads up and starting to howl. There was a strong echo at the station, and the roar was frightening. Ichijo continued to look cautiously at the crowd of wolves and realized that there were too many of them. Without an axe, the boy would definitely not be able to stand here. On top of that, the young man continued to feel that ominous pressure coming from the depths of the station. The boss was definitely here now, so he needed to take a weapon. Soon, a silhouette of a monster appeared from a dark corner, approaching the rest of the crowd. It was much larger in size, and its eyes sparkled in the darkness. Ichijo said that it would be better for the girl to sleep properly, but she objected. Half an hour later, she was already lying down, leaning her hands on the boy's bed and dozing peacefully. Ichijo stayed behind one of the pillars, came closer, and used analysis, wanting to know the statistics and indicators of the wolf boss. What he saw horrified him. The boss was a werewolf. Its level was 93, and its vitality and muscle power were more than 200, and its speed was more than 400. Due to the increase in the turning coefficient, the figures were sky-high and could not even be compared to the Minotaur. Now, Ichijo would probably be killed even with the cleaver of a fierce bull. The young man sat down, wanting to leave this place quietly. He had learned enough, and now he needed to retreat in order to think of a plan to subdue the werewolf. After Ichijo climbed back up onto the streets of the city, he began to run, wanting to get as far away from the wolf's den as possible. He soon sat down near one of the houses. Ichijo knew that all this would take time, but he had no choice but to rise to a level where he could fight him. The young man sighed and thought that he could speed up his progress if he had some kind of quest related to monsters. But Ichijo didn't even know the conditions of its appearance, so he still didn't know how everything worked here. Suddenly he saw a goblin hiding from the guy behind a trash can. It occurred to him that the only quests he had completed were with goblins and minotaurs, but no more quests with enemies, even if they killed him at a lower level. At this point, Ichijo thought that the quest might appear when he was being killed by an enemy of his rank or higher. He stood up and remembered that there were orcs in the neighboring town. Ichijo smiled, enjoying the way Now was sleeping. Now it was time to return to the next problem and assess his status, which he hadn't checked for a long time. There were no other options left, since there were no more monsters left in this city to climb. So it was necessary to go and test this theory. Ichijo walked along the street for a long time, looking for some kind of transport. Soon he heard some strange noise coming from one of the houses. Ichijo decided to check its source. The young man entered the ruined building and saw a muscular monster picking at the dead body of a man. Ichijo used his analysis skill while looking at the monster. It was the orc the boy was looking for. The monster's level was 59. All indicators were around 150, except for luck and magic power. Ichijo thought that the orc's stats were about the same as his, so it suited him. Now he needed the orc to kill him, and then a new quest could open up. Ichijo walked into the room and spread his arms out to the side. The boy said that the orc seemed to be hungry and that fresh prey was right in front of him. The orc turned around and began to bare his teeth. Slowly rising, the monster grabbed his club and headed towards the young man who stood at the entrance. At some point, the orc began to scream and raised his club, preparing a powerful blow. Ichijo, however, continued to stand in one place without hesitation. Ichijo's head with his sharp club. The swing was really strong, but the boy's body did not move and remained in place. The monster's weapon stopped where it wanted to strike. Ichijo stood firmly on his feet and looked at the orc through his bangs. 2 days passed, and the guy's progression coefficient became equal to 2.66%. Now said that now it increases by 1% per day, and before it accumulated in half a day. The monster was surprised that the boy was still alive, and besides that, he stayed where he was. Ichijo smirked and told him that it wasn't enough. The boy continued to provoke the orc, telling him to brace himself and strike with all his might. The monster began to swing again to finish it off. The orc was furious and made another blow that raised dust all around. This time he really put all his strength into it. Ichijo continued to remain alive. The guy understood that he had put himself in a very awkward position due to the fact that he had pumped up his body fortification to level 3. Now it was not so easy for him to die, and this made everything seem much more hellish because it was stretched out in time. The pain was intense, and the guy's body continued to be covered with abrasions. But Ichijo continued to stand, slightly bending towards the ground. His gaze was already completely empty, and he tried to restrain himself. The orc looked at the use with incomprehension. It was of course painful, but Ichijo had something to compare it to, because no matter how many times he died, it was painful and scary. But everything was done for a reason. While the orc continued to try to kill the boy, Ichijo continued to think and endure, realizing that it would be better for this to happen to him than to now. Ichijo looked up once again and said that he would die as many times as it took, because this time he would do everything to keep his promise. The script, together with you, began to progress. Ichijo Akira's death was confirmed, and the special skill, Resurrection, was also used again. The crowds of onlookers continued to stand in place and watch as the brave girl who provoked the monster was about to die. Considering that she stood up for people, she did not receive any response in return. It was obvious that the speed had slowed down. This was probably due to the slowdown in progression that had affected the guy after defeating the Class C monster, the Minotaur. So, the guy did it, and he got a D-class quest. It was called Orc Attacker, and the conditions were to defeat 50 orcs. Ichijo took his axe and was ready to start raising his level and progressing in order to further resist the werewolf and put an end to this. After Ichijo completed the quest, he received a reward of 30 points, which was extremely useful. The guy was standing in the middle of the road, and there were several orcs killed near him. In the end, Ichijo now had 47 points to spend. It was a good accumulation, and it was time to strengthen it by unlocking new abilities. The guy opened the skills window and started thinking about what skill he should buy. At some point, the guy decided that he would definitely raise the level of one of his skills. Ichijo decided that he needed to pump up the automatic regeneration. It was hard when the guy felt the damage from the battle with the Minotaur every time he came back from death. He had used up a full 30 points, but there was nothing else to do. The 17 remaining points would have been better distributed among the ability values, or to acquire a new skill for combat. Studying the skill grid, the guy understood that if he used them for sprinting, then he would be able to overcome the wolf's speed. But the problem was that it would not have a decisive meaning. He needed a skill that would definitely be useful to him, and then he saw Titanic Power, which cost 15 points. It was an active skill that consumed magic power. With all this, the skill, as well as sprint, increased muscle strength, while consuming magical power. If the guy has this skill, then he will already be able to surpass the endurance of the wolf. In short, if the guy hadn't killed the boss monster, the speed of the global reversal would have increased, raising the strength of the monsters, which would have reduced the chances of winning. Here, Ichijo sat down. He thought that if he recalled, he was sure that when he saw this skill before, it was worth 10 points. But for some reason, the indicator increased. Maybe if he were to acquire a skill that changes his status depending on the consumption of magical power, he would already spend more points acquiring skills of the same system. Well, okay. Now all that was left was to analyze the werewolf's attack pattern, die at his paws, and thus open the same quest as he had received with the Minotaur. Throwing the axe over his shoulder, the boy headed towards the subway. Ichijo consoled himself with the fact that he had only one effort left, where he would have to suffer. Ichijo's preparations were almost complete. Everything else now depended on Now, since she was not feeling well at the moment. But the script would only fail if they won together. After his latest death, which Ichijo received in a wolf boss's lair, he woke up in a hospital room and began to stretch. He felt much better. The pain was completely gone, and the increase in auto-regeneration was definitely worth it. Now the guy was ready to perform. Ichijo left his room. When Ichijo went out into the corridor, someone called out to him from behind. The guy turned around and saw Major Kurube there. The soldier said that he was just about to go to the guy's room. Kurube then inquired about the boy's condition, seeing that he could already move independently. Ichijo said that he did not have time yet, so he couldn't linger with the major in the corridor to give a detailed explanation. But the guy did say that he promised to defeat the wolf boss. Ichijo continued to lie on his bed and think. He knew that someone had to take the initiative and defeat the bosses. But it seemed that at the moment that person could only be him. Kurube was extremely surprised by what he heard, but he completely trusted the guy, so he waved his hand and said that they would definitely see each other again in such a case. Ichijo approached the girl's room and knocked on the door. He warned Now that he was about to enter and opened the door almost immediately. After the guy entered the room, he saw Now, who was still sitting in the corner of the room covered with a blanket. It was obvious that she still felt uneasy. Ichijo informed the girl that he had finished his preparations. He extended his hand to the girl and said that it was time for them to set out. Now said with a trembling voice that it was still impossible for her. She repeated that she couldn't fight the monsters anymore. Ichijo said that it was okay and she didn't have to fight. The guy explained that the boss they would have to fight was a werewolf. That is, a wolf standing on 2 legs. His main opponent would be Ichijo, but the girl had to attack him with magic once during the fight. After that, when the guy defeats him and kills the boss, the condition for the script, kill the boss together, should be met and now will be freed from this hell. She would only need to attack once. At the same time, the boss had wolves under his command, but now the boss had sent them out to hunt. The plan was that the girl would use magic once and could hide. Ichijo said that in the meantime he would finish what they started. The guy promised that he would not let her die under any circumstances, so they only had to get out once. Now looked at Ichijo and said that she understood everything. The girl thought that if she had to get out just once, she would definitely succeed. Moreover, many people already knew him after what happened, but the guy did not want to be a hero, and he was not going to become one. At that moment, he only wanted to protect Nao. Ichijo thanked Nao and helped her up. After they got ready, the boys walked out into the city, passing the military at the main entrance to the hospital. Ichijo and Nao walked through the city. The boy walked ahead the whole time, checking the road ahead. Nao, armed with a pistol, followed behind. Coming to the next corner, Ichijo looked around the corner. The guy saw that there were still many monsters moving around the city, and mostly they were huge insects. Among them were giant ants that made disgusting sounds and spiders that wove their webs, linking houses together. Ichijo knew that it was quite dangerous to go further. He wasn't worried about himself, but more about Nao. He didn't know how the girl would react to the monster's attack. Afterwards, he turned to Nao and saw the girl trembling. He immediately began to remember himself when he was going through his first days, so he decided that he needed to find an alternative. The boy came closer to Nao, put down his axe, and took the girl by the shoulders. He began to calm her down and said that they could go another way, a safer one. Letting go would take much longer and they would lose some time, but they needed to avoid colliding with the engines as much as possible. They turned around and started walking back, when at some point Nao felt something was wrong and turned around. She was very scared when she saw this horror. Behind them was a huge spider, which was starting to descend towards the girl. On its belly was a huge eye, and its jaw was making a chilling grinding sound. The guy looked at the girl again and finished his thought, telling himself that if he could protect at least her, then that would already be enough for him. Cold sweat immediately formed on Nao's face, and the girl began to tremble violently. Her body stopped obeying her again, and she was about to tell Ichijo about the spider. But she couldn't do anything. Her voice also stopped obeying her, and the girl began to slowly fall to her knees, believing that this was another end. The monster rushed at the girl, opening its mouth. All Nao could do was close her eyes and freeze in place. The spider was too close to the girl. Ichijo's voice. He said that everything was fine and asked her to open her eyes. The guy said that he would protect her at any moment. Opening her eyes fully, Nao saw that the spider had already been killed by the young man, and his axe was already covered in blood. They were ready to continue their journey together. The road was clear. Ichijo took Nao's hands and squeezed them tightly. He said that they were together now, and the girl was very dear to him. He only asked her to believe him and not doubt. Tears began to well up in Nao's eyes. The girl looked the guy in the eyes and thanked him, and then said that she would try very hard. Ichijo smiled, saying that he believed in Nao. He knew that if they couldn't kill the boss this time, Nao would most likely never recover. There was a lot at stake, and Ichijo understood that he could not allow the girl to die, no matter what it took. Ichijo continued to reason, believing that everything was fine. He had fought the werewolf many times, and calculated how to fight to defeat him. He needed to calm down as much as possible and the guy would cope. At some point, while he was lying there, thinking about everything, the girl started to get up on her feet. Ichijo called out to her, but she didn't answer and simply moved to the bed. Soon, they came to that very descent into the subway, which was all in blood. Nao was scared, and Ichijo, looking down, said that this was exactly where they needed to go. Failure was unacceptable, and Ichijo was highly motivated by the fact that Nao was with him now. He'd taken a step, and there was no turning back, so he would definitely defeat the boss now. Ichijo now went down to move deeper, getting closer to the boss's lair. The wolves were still hunting, so they had to fight without any interference. Ichijo turned to the girl and addressed her. The guy reminded her once again that there were certain conditions of the script that they had to fulfill. Now held the gun in her hands and said that she remembered. She needed to carry out a successful attack, and when the guy defeats the monster, the script will be executed immediately. The girl said she could handle it, and Ichijo didn't have to worry. They soon descended into the very them. In a few hours, a pack of wolves was supposed to attack the hospital. They had to deal with the boss before that time. The boy looked into the darkness, where the werewolf usually came from. He was concentrated and completely collected. Ichijo took a firmer grip on the axe and told the girl to get ready. Now shuddered and asked if the boss the guy was talking about was here. Suddenly, a system announcement appeared before the girl's eyes. She also received a C-class quest that she needed to defeat a werewolf to complete. The girl also looked forward and soon saw the boss who appeared from around the corner. It was the same monster that killed Now for the first time after activating the script. This made Ichijo very confused. He said Now's name again, and therefore thought that the girl most likely wanted to get closer to him. But he didn't know whether he should do it now. She immediately remembered him, and the girl was thrown into a shudder. She did not think that they would have to fight such a huge beast. And since he killed her earlier, the girl also received a quest. Now was getting worse with each passing second. She looked at the werewolf and couldn't believe that Ichijo was going to fight such a huge and powerful monster. Ichijo continued to stand calmly, but Now's legs were already starting to tremble and cramp. She thought it was impossible to defeat such a powerful boss. The werewolf immediately rushed to attack, leaning back on Now. Ichijo stood nearby and stopped the monster, holding out his cleaver. The girl continued to stand silently, very scared. Afterwards, the werewolf lunged again, but Ichijo grabbed Now and used Sprint to drag the girl aside. Now held Ichijo's hand very tightly, still shaking. Everything happened so fast that Now couldn't even see anything. She didn't understand how she could handle the attack that she was supposed to hit that monster with. The werewolf began to strike repeatedly, gradually getting closer to his target. Ichijo, however, continued to keep everything under control. At the moment when the werewolf decided to attack, Ichijo used Sprint, and the 60-second countdown of the skill began. The guy rushed towards the beast, dodging the werewolf's tenacious paw. Ichijo placed the axe on the ground and then pushed off from it, maneuvering and sneaking up on the monster from the unarmed side. Ichijo delivered a powerful kick that sent the boss flying towards the wall. The wall immediately cracked, and Ichijo continued his pursuit, keeping a minimum distance. The guy, continuing to lie motionless, quietly said Now's name. She said something incomprehensible and continued to lie with her eyes closed, clinging to the guy. Joining the wolf that was trapped in the wall, Ichijo pinned the boss with his axe and began to press down on him, trying to keep the beast in one place. The guy then turned to Now and started yelling at her that now was the moment for her to launch her attack. Now's eyes widened and she was confused. The next moment, the girl took a few steps from her hiding place and pointed the gun at the werewolf who was trying to escape. The beast looked straight into the girl's eyes. He bared his teeth and began to spread his terrifying aura around. Now had never encountered this before, so she was completely unprepared. The girl shuddered, dropping the gun from her hands. She was terribly frightened, and her whole body stopped obeying her again. At that moment, the werewolf released one of its paws and struck at Ichijo, sending the boy flying. The wolf let out a terrifyingly loud roar and rushed forward. Ichijo was thrown back into the carriage, but the guy managed to grab the werewolf by the hand and drag him along. Their battle would then move and continue there. Now fell to her knees and bowed her head down. The girl's whole body was frozen with fear, just like when she saw other monsters. She couldn't pull herself together. She understood that she could do nothing about it. The mere sight of these horrible beasts triggered panic processes in her, which completely blocked her self-control. The girl continued to sit and shake, repeating in her head that she couldn't fight at all, no matter what she tried to do with herself. Ichijo closed his eyes and was surprised that the girl was talking in her sleep. At some point, he realized that Now hadn't slept well for a couple of days, so the best solution was to accept it. At the same time, the noise of pogrom was coming from the carriage. The werewolf grabbed Ichijo with his clawed paw and was destroying everything that was in the train. The guy continued to fight back, realizing that with Nao's current state, there was nothing left to do but leave this script. Right now, the best option would be to find and defeat another boss. But now Ichijo decided that, for now, he would finish off this huge werewolf alone, because he had brought him a lot of torment and trouble with his appearance. The guy was really angry. After all, it was because the script for this wolf was activated that Nao had to go through this whole nightmare during the preparation. The guy activated Sprint again and began to crush the werewolf, throwing him away. The boss broke through the carriage and fell back onto the station, fell and slid on the platform. Afterwards, Ichijo caught up with him once again and began to hit him in a targeted manner, throwing the werewolf down onto the rails so that the boss would be as far away from Nao as possible. When the werewolf was already lying on its back and breathing heavily, Ichijo jumped up and raised his axe, shouting that this was where he would put an end to this werewolf. Ichijo continued flying towards the werewolf, as it made a sound resembling a grin, and its eyes began to glow brightly. Ichijo did not understand the reason for this. As it turned out, the werewolf boss also had magic, and increased his stamina by using some special skill. Ichijo definitely didn't expect this turn of events. The monster increased its vitality, and the battle began anew. The werewolf began to rise to its feet, while Ichijo was still in the air. He thought that she needed to get some sleep. She had a pleasant smell and, as he inhaled it carefully, Ichijo remembered that he needed to do something about his injured body. While the boy was still flying towards the wolf, raising his axe, the monster immediately disappeared from sight and appeared behind Ichijo, revealing his defenseless back. Afterwards, the werewolf launched an associate attack. Using its magic and skills, the boss gradually began to strengthen, fighting back against Ichijo. The situation changed dramatically. The wolf turned the boy around and began to strike him repeatedly and with great force in the torso, tearing at his clothes and flesh. Ichijo howled in pain and began to fall to the ground. After a series of blows, the werewolf threw Ichijo far to the side, and the guy could do nothing about it. He flew a few meters and soon hit the ground with great force. Ichijo was still alive and showed no signs of giving up, slowly getting back up on his feet. He didn't understand what had happened. The werewolf had quickly seized the initiative, turning the entire fight upside down. Blood ran all over the young man's body. The werewolf walked towards the boy, and then Ichijo quickly used the skill Analysis. The wolf's speed parameter increased and became 100 points higher than last time. No matter how many times Ichijo had fought the monster, this had never happened before. And the words the wolf had spoken recently. It turned out that monsters could also use skills. Ichijo stood up as the werewolf continued to approach him. The wolf turned to the other side and began to howl loudly. Ichijo saw all this and realized that the monster had now turned its gaze to Nao and decided that it would finish off the girl first. Ichijo, breathing heavily, told him to wait. The Minotaur continued to move, even with a huge hole in the middle of his body. It was still very strange that it did not kill him, but there was no time to think of a new way. He opened his status and saw that there had been several updates. He saw Inventory and Script, which were not there before. They definitely appeared after the defeat of the Minotaur. Afterwards, the guy put one hand behind his head and said that the werewolf wasn't going anywhere now because they weren't done yet. The boss was provoked by these words and turned to the guy. The werewolf decided that it would be much easier for him to first remove the obstacle in his path in the form of a man with a cleaver, so he immediately rushed towards him. The wolf struck, and Ichijo immediately covered himself with his hands. He then spread his arms and struck the wolf. The boss was thrown back several meters. The boy understood that right now, when he brought Nao here and told her that this would be the only time, he could not give up. Ichijo had to protect the girl at any cost. Ichijo, again, continuing to use the associated attack skill. Ichijo knew that if he didn't dodge Nao, he would lose all chances of winning. It was time to go all in, so Ichijo moved his last few points into his magic power. This maneuver restored the full skill usage time. Now Ichijo was faster than the werewolf. The guy activated the skills Sprint and Titanic Force at once, and then rushed to attack the monster in return. After a series of blows, the werewolf began to wheeze and spit blood. Ichijo understood that he still had a chance, and he had dealt a decent amount of damage now. The boss must have been at his limit too. Grabbing an axe, Ichijo charged at the werewolf, knowing that he most likely needed to make one more successful breakthrough, and the werewolf would say goodbye to its life. As soon as Ichijo jumped up and rushed towards the wolf's head, the monster let out its howl again, which was much louder than the previous time. It was already somewhat reminiscent of the fight with the Minotaur. The boy clicked on the inventory and saw 4 empty spaces. He thought that the inventory was similar to the one in some games. Ichijo decided that it was possible to put items in it. Ichijo was thrown back and was unable to complete the attack that would have ended the fight. Then Ichijo heard a noise that was right below him. A multitude of light steps, which did not belong to humans but to animals, began to trample the floor on the upper floor. The wolves were returning to their lair. Behind the werewolf appeared the same 3-headed wolf with which Ichijo had already fought in a hospital in front of the military. The boss was closely watching the guy. Ichijo continued to hold his weapon, realizing that the boss had called his subordinate monsters, and now who was at the entrance, was in grave danger. While the battle between the boss and Ichijo was going on at a very fast pace, the girl continued to sit on her knees the entire time, being at the very beginning of the station. At some point, everything became quiet, and the girl heard footsteps nearby. She began to gradually remove her hands, which she had been covering her ears with, hoping that it was all over. When she raised her head, she saw a 3-headed wolf approaching her, drooling on the floor. He began to sniff the girl and intended to eat her. Ichijo immediately ran away from the wolves that ran after him. The guy now had the main task, saving Now, who was probably in danger. The guy realized that the decision to keep his distance had ultimately played a cruel joke on him and worked quite the opposite. He had to run to her quickly before trouble happened. Meanwhile, the 3-headed wolf continued to approach the girl. Now was scared and began to gradually back away, shouting at the monster to retreat. He had to check it out. The guy carefully turned to the shelf where his phone was and picked up the smartphone. Then he opened the inventory and saw that the phone was displayed. At this point, the 2-headed wolf broke loose and began to open his mouth. He rushed to attack the girl, gaining speed, but at that moment, something stopped him. Right in front of him, when the wolf was already at its target, Ichijo appeared, who covered Now with his body. The guy clenched his teeth in pain, but continued to stand firmly on his feet. Now screamed in horror as she watched. Ichijo was bleeding all over and was looking at Now, who was still alive and unscathed. After breaking free from the 3-headed wolf's jaws, Ichijo turned around and began hacking at the monster with the Minotaur's cleaver, driving it back. The monster was soon defeated. Itzy was exhausted and could hardly stand on his feet. He bent down, still holding the axe, and the girl meanwhile shrank and quietly said the boy's name. She looked at the tired and injured Ichijo. She saw how the boy could barely stand on his feet, and his entire body was covered in scars from the claws and teeth of monsters. Ichijo turned around and smiled at Now. The boy said that he wasn't that bad. It wasn't a cause for concern. Of course, he wanted to reassure Now. After the danger passed, Ichijo knew that it was not the end and he had to fight on. The boy rushed towards the boss, saying that he would finish everything. As he ran away, Ichijo shouted for Now to hide safely. The girl extended her hand, shouting for the boy to stop and for this bloodthirsty battle to cease. She watched as Ichijo continued to fight the wolves and was surprised that he could still stand on his feet. She didn't understand where he got his strength from, and yet he still smiled at her. In theory, after the guy removed the phone from the inventory, the phone should have disappeared. He decided to check it out and pressed the delete button. A script appeared on the screen. Now began to remember all the moments that happened to them before. Ichijo always smiled at the girl and was as friendly as possible, no matter what situation happened in their lives. She also recalled the case when 2 guys were pestering a girl, offering her a little fun. It was still in school and those guys were seniors. Ichijo, dressed in a school uniform, immediately appeared in front of them. The boy put his fists forward and told the 2 to leave the girl alone. The boy was not particularly strong during his school years, so he quickly received several blows that knocked into his feet. The seniors fell behind and started to walk away. Now leaned over the boy and asked why it all came to a fight. Yes, Ichijo was not exactly a tough guy back then. He continued to lie on the ground, turning his head towards the girl. Ichijo then smiled and said that the most important thing was that Now was okay no matter how it was achieved. Now continued to sit with her hands on the floor. A bunch of thoughts continued to float through her head, and the moment came when she had to make a decision. Ichijo continued his battle with the boss, receiving more blows from the werewolf. At some point, the boss pressed the guy against the wall and began squeezing him with his paws. Now saw all this and understood that now no one could help Ichijo except her. The rumble continued, and the groans of the young man who was slowly suffering defeat could be heard at the station. Now understood that no matter how many wounds Ichijo received, he gave everything of himself to protect her. And yet she did nothing, continuing to sit there and cry. The system gave a message that the script was not currently activated. Ichijo was indignant about this because there was no special description either. At some point, the girl reached for the gun and squeezed it tightly with her hand. She understood that this could not continue, because earlier she had given herself a word. The girl promised that she would support Ichijo. She stood up and raised her gun. The tears in her eyes were not dry yet, but she was ready. Taking aim, the girl told herself that she could no longer hesitate. She too had to move in this world that had gradually turned into a living hell. Now shouted that she would be with Ichijo and fired a magic arrow towards the werewolf, who was pinning the boy against the wall. The werewolf only had time to shift his gaze when he was immediately struck by a magic arrow. Ichijo was aware of what had happened before his eyes. He knew it was now. The werewolf stumbled, jumped to the side, and let go of Ichijo. At that moment, it seemed like the boss had become even more ferocious from being suddenly attacked. The guy turned towards the girl, smiling at her. Now came closer, still holding the gun in her hands. She said that everything would be fine now. Afterwards, she cried out that together they would defeat this monster and she would help Ichijo in any way she could. Afterwards, he thought that he had accumulated enough points and now it would be possible to distribute them among different characteristics. He opened the system again and began to get acquainted with his parameters. Some items were shortened, but what caught his attention was that the sprint skill did not restore the amount of magic used. Therefore, it displayed the amount of possible use. Still holding the phone in his hands, the guy selected several characteristics, distributing points. He also took a new skill for restoring magic and wanted to test it. The second skill was automatic regeneration, which restored physical strength over time. The pain began to subside after this, so the guy realized that it was working. His characteristics had risen quite a bit, and the guy realized that he could now fight even strong monsters. There were 2 points left, which he wanted to use to increase his sprint strength. That very second felt like an hour to Izure. He was rushing towards the girl, covered in bruises, and his mind was spinning with the various moments he had with now. At some point, the guy also realized that when he distributes points, they also affect his body. At some point, he thought that he can change it as he wants. After everything was distributed, the guy exhaled and quietly said that now he was stronger and all that was left was to wait for the fox to fully recover. The blanket began to move. Ichijo looked down and saw now starting to wake up. The girl's eyes widened and she stared at the boy, who was also surprised. The girl turned to Ichijo and awkwardly said, "Good morning." The guy continued to be embarrassed and couldn't say anything sensible. Now blushed and asked the boy how it happened that she ended up in bed. Ichijo said that the girl was half asleep and at some point she lay down next to him. After a few moments, Ichijo continued to look at Nao and then asked the girl if she was planning on getting off. Nao thought about it and said that it was time. Afterwards, the girl raised her head and said what would happen if she refused, because she didn't want to leave. This question drove Ichijo into a stupor, making him freeze. She gazed intently into his languid eyes, and they were alone in the room, maintaining this awkward pause that had arisen between them. Nao positioned herself above Ichijo. The boy opened his mouth and quietly said the girl's name. He felt embarrassed, not knowing what to do next in the situation. Nao began to gradually approach Ichijo. She never thanked him for saving her life. The girl wanted to kiss the guy. He remembered the girl asking him if he was feeling unwell. At that moment, she offered her help and said that Ichijo could consult with her at any time. But just as they were about to merge into a kiss, they were interrupted by a loud knock on the door of the ward. After several strong knocks, the door opened, and a man in a military uniform entered the room. He apologized for the intrusion and then introduced himself as a major in the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force who asked to be called Karabi. The man said that he rushed to the room as soon as he heard that Ichijo had woken up. He immediately saw the image of Nao standing on the bed. covering the boy with a blanket. Ichijo and Now were embarrassed. The girl felt doubly awkward, and after the major said that the boys could take their time, she began to justify herself, saying that he could have misunderstood everything. Now immediately moved to her chair, which was next to the hospital bed. The major coughed lightly into his fist and said that it wouldn't take the guys much time. The soldier said his name was Karube Minoru. They, the Japan Self-Defense Force, were currently protecting this hospital from monsters along with some of the civilians, including Nao-san. Ichijo was surprised that Nao-san was also on the defense. The girl said that she forgot to tell about it because the Japanese self-defense forces are not that many, so the civilians joined them. The major said that the boy had defeated the Minotaur, and in recent days they had all been remembering that it was thanks to Ichijo that many of the city's residents had been saved, for which he expressed gratitude. Ichijo very much, and he opened his eyes wide. He certainly didn't expect to hear such words and thought about it, getting up from the bed. The major added that in connection with this incident, they would like to ask the young man for something, or when she got upset and started to cry, quietly saying that if she could just laugh with him or have a drink, then that would be real happiness for her. For this reason, they were on guard at the hospital. Soon, another soldier of strong build entered the room. The man also apologized and said that he would disturb everyone for a couple of minutes. When he went a little further into the room, he saw a dark-haired guy. He immediately asked the young man if he was the same Ichijo that everyone had told him about. Ichijo really didn't expect that much attention would be focused on him, and as a result, the boy was completely unprepared. The young man hesitated, thinking about what to answer him. The soldier looked closely at the guy on the bed. He realized that this was indeed the guy who defeated the Minotaur boss, and he was only level 9, which was quite weak. The soldier chuckled, saying that Ichijo now looked like a worn-out rag. He also added that it seemed that there was no help to be expected from the young man in the near future. The major sternly asked Makimoto the reason for his visit. The soldier said that he had just decided to drop in and see what the boy looked like, but it turned out that there was no reason at all. Makimoto said that he was only disappointed, and then turned his gaze to Nao. He asked who this girl was, noticing that she was just his type and he liked her. The soldier leaned over to Nao and asked her how old she was and what her name was. Makimoto continued to inquire about the place where the girl had lived before, repeating that she was his type. Nao turned away, but the soldier did not let up his pressure. The guy noticed that in the last place where he had to be, they protected the kids, who were not even wanted. He couldn't say that about this hospital at all, because he found such a beautiful girl there. Afterwards, the soldier said that he had decided everything and offered Nao to meet him.